Chapter 1842. Soul God did not move. It was so quiet that it made people a little nervous. However, Bufong did not pay much attention to it. He drew the place in the Queen of Curse's memory and asked everyone to search for it. Earth was so big, but that was only relative to mortals. For the immortals present, it would not take them long to circle it. Of course, it was still quite difficult to find a small place in detail. But at least the immortals had a target. The whole ancestral planet seemed to be turned upside down. These immortals kept searching. Tong Tian, Yuan Shi Tianzuan, and other experts joined the search. It was not an exaggeration to say that they were digging 3 feet into the ground. During this time, Bufong, on the other hand, wandered leisurely on Earth. Then he brought Nethery and Whitey to visit Swearin Emperor, who was alone in a cave on the domed ceiling. They brought him barbecued meat and wine, and they had a pleasant conversation. After the visit, they went to various places on the ancestral planet. Time passed very quickly. Half a month passed. The immortals on the ancestral planet found nothing. They could not find the place Bufong described. Tong Tian was a little anxious. He found Bufong sitting in a small boat. The longer it dragged on, the more uneasy Tong Tian became. If Soul God really collected the heart, it would be a disaster for all the experts present. Can't you find it? Bufong held the fishing rod and did not move. The fish did not move, and he did not move either. Xiao Bai, and you sat in the distance and watched quietly. Tong Tian frowned and sighed deeply. It shouldn't be. The god of cooking brought Soul God's heart back to the ancestral planet. Under normal circumstances, it should be hidden in the land of buried bones. Have you searched the ancestral planet's secret realm? Bufong asked. The fishing rod moved. Bufong's hand shook as if he had hit the surface of the sea. A fat fish flew out of his fishing rod. Bufong whipped the fish with his fishing rod. Xiaobai reached out, grabbed the fish, and threw it into the bucket at his feet. I've searched everywhere, but there's no trace of him at all. Tong Tian frowned. They had searched for all the arcane realms in the ancestral star, but they still could not find anything. The soul demons on the ancestral planet had been completely wiped out, but there was still no trace or news of the soul god. To them, this was not good news. Bufong got up, picked up the bucket, stepped on the skiff, and left the sea. The group got off the boat and walked on a remote island. I've searched every corner of the ancestral star's secret realms as well. Bufong frowned slightly and fell in a deep thought. They returned to the wooden house on the island. The wind on the island was very warm, and the sunlight was very warm. Bufong placed the fish that was caught in the bucket on the chopping board and started to process the fish with the kitchen knife. Tong Tian said. Bufong, on the other hand, was thinking as he cooked the fish. Of course, although he was thinking, his movements were not slow. Sizzle. As soon as the fish was put into the wok, plumes of steam rose, thick smoke, and the aroma of meat filled the air. Tong Tian twitched his nose and rested his eyes on the fish in the wok. Is Soul God's heart not on the ancestral planet? Bufong seemed to think of something, but soon he shook his head. If Soul God's heart was not on the ancestral planet, where could it be? When the god of cooking took Soul God's heart and left the center of the Great War, he returned to the ancestral planet and went into seclusion. That old man was Soul God who followed the emotional path, so he would not go to the extreme of the heartless path. So, Bufong suddenly paused. His hand stopped moving. The aroma surged. Could we have been misled? Soul God's heart might not be on the ancestral planet. Bufong said. The corner of Tong Tian's mouth twitched. No way. If it's not on Earth, where could it be? The immortals and deities who had searched for the place had returned, but none of them had found anything. Their expressions were regretful. Not finding the place meant that the danger had not disappeared. The fear brought by Soul God was still lingering in their hearts. The great Tianyuan world, it was a newborn world, a great world suspended in the primitive universe. It was filled with vast spiritual energy of heaven and earth. The sky was vast, and the wilderness was vast. The wind blew, and the grass drooped. It was Nyohansan. A wooden hut loomed in the boundless grassland. Trees towered into the sky, piercing through the clouds. Immortal energy swirled around the heaven tree. Blood lobsters leaped in the gurgling water. Because it was a newborn great world, very few lives were born in it. There were some, but they were still in a state of ignorance. Perhaps the only one who could be considered intelligent was Nyohan-san. Today, Nyohan-san was wandering leisurely in the great Tianyuan world. In this great world, Nyohan-san, was the true god. The great Tianyuan world was transformed from Bufang's heaven and earth farmland. It was provided to Bufang by the system. When Bufang stripped his divine sense and true form to suppress Soul God, Bufang had sent the farmland out and turned it into a great world full of vitality. Bufang had developed this great world from a small farmland inch by inch. At first, it was just a small garden. However, as Bufang's strength grew, the farmland grew larger and everything became richer. Any plant or treasure could be grown here. Moreover, with the appearance of Nyohan-san, the farmland became a secret in Bufang's heart. However, ever since Bufang had stepped onto the emotional path, even though he had recovered his cultivation base, he did not take the farmland back. Instead, he allowed it to develop. In Bufang's opinion, the farmland could even turn into a Tianyuan universe in the future. The addition of another universe was a great thing for all living beings in the world. Of course, Bufang would not stop such a good thing from happening. So, he let Nyohan-san do whatever he wanted. Today, Nyohan-san was the only one left in the great Tianyuan world. Bufang's apprentices could no longer enter the farmland. During Bufang's time of 1,000 returns to mortality, Nyohan-san, on the other hand, lived leisurely in the farmland, enjoying the glory of being a god. He was immortal and lived for eternity. In the past 1,000 years, except for when he left the farmland and went to the immortality planet to cry for Bufang, he had basically stayed here. It had been a long time since Nyohan-san had learned hybridization. It was not that he did not want to learn, but since Bufang left the farmland, his hybridization ability had disappeared. A warm wind blew over. Nyohan-san yawned lazily. He sat on the recliner in front of the wooden house, which creaked. He could control the will of the great path in the great Tianyuan world. Therefore, he could do whatever he wanted here, call the wind and summon the rain. 80 was running on the grass. The three-eyed wild lion, the 8 treasures pig, and other old friends were living leisurely. The blood lobsters and fish in the river were living a carefree life. Nyohan-san was very satisfied. Owner-boo, your soul in heaven should be very happy. This old cow did not let you down. Nyohan-san thought. Bufang, who was fishing on the calm surface of earth, did not know why, but he suddenly yawned. Who was cursing him? Bufang looked expressionlessly at the boundless sea and thought. Rumble, outside the great Tianyuan world. The void began to slowly distort. The sound of footsteps rang out. A figure wrapped in a black robe walked out of it. Black chi swirled around him, and very quickly, it turned into 7 figures. The auras of these 7 figures were too strong, and their faces looked basically the same. They hovered outside the great Tianyuan world. The black robe slowly rose. A pair of scarlet eyes were revealed under it. Found it. A hoarse voice rang out. Soul God's tone was filled with excitement and irrepressible excitement. He had not given up after being sealed by the god of cooking. He had not given up after being sealed by Bufang. Now he had finally found it. Looking at the picturesque great Tianyuan world in the distance, Soul God slowly spread his hands. He had thought that his heart was sealed on earth. However, he was wrong. The god of cooking had misled him. He thought it was on earth, but when he arrived, he searched for it for a long time. He could not find it at all. Furious, he scolded the god of cooking, even though the latter was already dead. But even if he was dead, why did he trick him? Then he began to think like crazy. He thought of the grassland, the wooden hut. He thought of the blue sky, the white clouds, and the lazy spirit beasts. Soul God sensed it. He was the god of cooking, and the god of cooking was him. Soul God grinned excitedly. That old fool, the god of cooking, wanted to bury his heart. But could he hide it? Nyohan-san was lying in front of the wooden hut, snoring. Suddenly, He jolted up and felt a chill run through him. He looked up at his surroundings and felt that the world seemed to have turned pitch black at this moment. Neo-Han-san was startled. What happened? He looked up at the sky. The rolling black clouds were filled with a terrifying power that made his heart tighten. He could not muster any thought of resisting that power. Damn it! A great villain has invaded? Neo-Han-san was startled. He flipped over and jumped off the deck chair, then quickly rushed into the wooden hut. 80, the three-eyed wild lion, and the others were also startled and hid. Rumble in the sky. 8 silhouettes slowly descended. The warm wind became very sharp, like a knife, cutting their cheeks. Soul God took a deep breath and spread his hands. This aura, it's like blood. It's familiar. Soul God breathed greedily. In the wooden hut, Neo-Han-san was horrified. Staring at Soul God outside, he did not know what to say. That guy is Soul God. Such a terrible aura. He's even more terrible than those almighty experts of the primitive universe. Neo-Han-san did not dare to make a sound. 80 ran in and shrank in his arms, not daring to move. Neo-Hansen's mind was a little confused now. However, he did not lose his composure. His eyes lit up with a thought. He was now the master of the heaven and earth farmland, and he had mastered the power of the Great Path. What was he afraid of? Anyone who invades the heaven and earth farmland will be expelled by the will of the Great Path. Neo-Han-san said excitedly. Then he controlled the will of the Great Path and sent it towards Soul God and the others. Rumble. Soul God stood on the grass. His black robe flapped noisily in the wind. Suddenly, Soul God raised his eyebrows and looked up at the sky. The whole sky suddenly changed dramatically. A gigantic ox demon appeared in the void and bellowed angrily at them. Then the horn fell and came crashing towards Soul God and the others. This was the will of the Great Path of the Great Tianyuan world. It was very terrifying. It carried the will of the world. In the wooden hut, Neo-Hansen's eyes glowed with golden light. Neo-Han-san was invincible. Moo! The horn fell. Boom! The whole ground suddenly collapsed and exploded. However, after a while, smoke and dust billowed away. Soul God raised his hand and gently grabbed the horn. The will of the Great Path? Ridiculous! The corner of Soul God's mouth twitched. He suddenly exerted force. Crack! The horn transformed from the will of the Great Path was crushed. Neo-Han-san let out a miserable scream in the wooden hut. Invincible, my ass. Chapter 1843. While the ox was sitting at home, disaster came from the sky. All Neo-Han-san wanted to say now was Mother ***. He could not believe that the will of the Great Path was crushed by this great fiend with a palm. How could he fight him? According to Neo-Hansen's estimation, this was not an opponent of the same level at all. If Neo-Han-san were not afraid of death, he would probably be killed in an instant. With the will of the Great Path of Heaven, Neo-Hansen's strength could probably reach the level of an ordinary chaotic saint, and this was because the Great Path of Heaven originally belonged to Bufong. However, even so, against this demon, it was as easy as smashing dry weeds and smashing rotten wood. Neo-Han-san held 80 in his arms, shivering. How could he fight him? This was going to kill the ox. So Neo-Han-san fled without hesitation. Soul God put his hands behind his back and crushed the ox horn transformed from the will of the Great Path. It was as easy as brushing away dust. His scarlet eyes turned and fell on a wooden hut in the distance. He tilted his head slightly. Soul God's scarlet eyes burst out with a divine light. Go! Soul God raised his hand and pointed at the wooden hut. Black smoke swirled around the body of a great soul overlord, and he moved in an instant. He appeared in front of the wooden hut as if he had teleported. Creak! A crisp sound rang out. The door of the wooden hut slowly opened. A meatball rolled out of the hut. It landed in front of the Great Soul Overlord's foot. The Great Soul Overlord was slightly puzzled, as if he did not quite understand what the meatball was. The next moment, an explosion rang out. The meatball, which contained the will of the great path that seemed to have been ignited, suddenly exploded. Energy waves swept out. With the wooden hut as the center, everything within hundreds of miles was turned into ruins. Smoke and dust billowed. The great soul overlord slowly crawled up from the ground. Although the power of the explosion was terrible, it did not kill him. After all, he was a great soul overlord who was as strong as a perfected saint. What a familiar power. This is the power of my heart. Soul God narrowed his eyes slightly and said with some nostalgia. The explosion caused the surroundings to turn into ruins. The water in the river surged violently, and the creatures in it frantically ran towards the shore. The blood lobster waved its claws and disappeared like a wisp of smoke. He stared at the large group of food creatures that were fleeing Soul God, and the great soul overlords did not know what to say. With 80 in his arms, Neo Hansen rode on the three-eyed wild lion and flew across the great world. The three-eyed wild lion had been nourished by the heaven and earth spirit Qi, so it had grown to an extraordinary level. When it ran, it was like the wind. Neo Hansen's forehead was covered in sweat. Soul God put too much pressure on him, so he could only use his hybrid beef meatballs to cover his escape. As for killing the great soul overlord with meatballs, Neo Hansen did not think he could do it. If only Onerbu was here. Neo Hansen's heart trembled with fear. He just wanted to live a leisurely life. Why did these demons come to him? Neo Hansen knew very well that once he fell into the hands of these demons, he would die without a doubt. Boom! A terrible fluctuation surged out from behind him. Neo Hansen's mind trembled slightly. He asked the three-eyed wild lion to follow the end of the great Tianyuan world. The great Tianyuan world was actually different from a spherical planet. Neo Hansen had carefully analyzed the heaven and earth farmland before. In the beginning, the heaven and earth farmland was only a small square area, and it was surrounded by hazy fog. As Bufang's cultivation base grew and his spiritual energy poured into the farmland, the surrounding fog kept merging with the spiritual energy, causing a strange change and creating a heaven and earth. The great heaven primordial world was not formed in the shape of a sphere. Instead, it developed horizontally like a chessboard. As the spiritual energy and the fog worked and combined, they piled up like blocks and formed a great world. At the end of the world, there were countless misty areas. Neo Hansen had explored those misty areas once. At that time, he was still ignorant. He had just been captured by Bufang and brought to the heaven and earth farmland. He had recklessly rushed into the mist and experienced a strange change. That mist contained an incomparably terrifying power. He had lost himself in it. Later, Neo Hansen did not know how he got out. However, after surviving a great disaster, he was bound to have good fortune later on. From then on, Neo Hansen had a special understanding of how to deal with ingredients. He had the ability to fuse the strange power with ingredients. From then on, Neo Hansen had reached the peak of the heaven and earth farmland. He had gained Onerbu's appreciation. He had helped Bufang research the death food tool, which could fuse all kinds of ingredients with energy. At this moment of crisis, Neo Hansen felt that perhaps only the mist could save him. Neo Hansen had always known that the mist would be very dangerous. If he went in, he did not know if he would be able to come out. But he had no choice. Soul God was too strong. He could not defeat him. Even Onerbu had fallen because of him. How could Neo Hansen defeat him? Faster, faster. Neo Hansen patted the three-eyed wild lion's butt and urged him to speed up. The lion seemed to understand the seriousness of the matter. Its mane fluttered as it sped up. However, next to him, the 8 treasures pig was running leisurely. It had inadvertently overtaken the three-eyed wild lion. Neo Hansen glanced at the 8 treasures pig and then at the three-eyed wild lion. He was speechless. Rumble. The terrible power of sin turned into a black dragon and swept toward him. The great Tianyuan world kept turning black under the impact of the power of sin. Neo Hansen felt his hair stand on end. He felt a cold aura coming from behind him. Damn it, spirits of the heavens, spirits of the earth. Onerbu, please show yourself. If your spirit is in heaven, please bless me so that I can escape safely." Neo-Han-san clasped his palms together and said. 80 poked its head out. Rumble. A great soul overlord suddenly descended. He slammed his palm on the ground, almost turning it into nothingness. The three-eyed wild lion roared and leaped up. He turned into a stream of light and rushed into the hazy and boundless gray fog. The great soul overlord approached. Looking at the gray mist, he felt a terrible crisis approaching. So, the great soul overlord gave up the chase and returned to Soul God's side. He walked over slowly. The 7 great soul overlords followed him. Standing in the gray mist that stretched around the great world, the corner of Soul God's mouth twitched slightly. "Here he is," he said. His scarlet eyes gleamed with a hint of desire. "All of you, form an array and protect me," Soul God said. Finally, the last moment had come. This time, he would not let the stinky chef interrupt him again, and he would not let the stinky chef ruin his plan again. He wanted the army of soul demons to invade the universe again. He, Soul God, wanted to step into the ancestral God realm again and become invincible in the universe. Rumble. The moment his voice rang out, the faces of the 7 great soul overlords froze. They tapped the ground with the tips of their feet and slid backward at high speed. The power of the 7 great sins surged out from their bodies. Arrogance, jealousy, anger, sloth, greed, lust, gluttony, the power of the 7 sins kept swirling. They turned into an array and rushed into the sky in a flash. It seemed to have turned into a huge barrier, sealing the entire heaven and earth farmland in it. The 7 great soul overlords rose into the sky. They sat cross-legged in midair, facing the boundless starry sky. They were Soul God's staunchest guardians, the heaven and earth farmland. Soul God tore his black robe. His body, which was as black as ink, emerged, but his chest kept turning into chaotic nothingness. Without his heart, he would not be complete. Otherwise, he would have ruled the world as an ancestral god. But now, he stood in front of his heart. All he needed to do was take out the heart that had been sealed for countless years and fuse with it completely. The real Soul God would return completely. He looked at the gray mist. Soul God's scarlet eyes immediately gleamed with anticipation. That old god of cooking actually misled me into thinking that the heart was on the ancestral planet of mankind, when it was actually hidden here. Unfortunately, no matter how you schemed, you only schemed against your own people. The god of cooking stuck out his tongue and licked his lips. There was a hint of excitement in his eyes. Soul God and the god of cooking were one. The god of cooking could fool everyone, but not him. This was the god of cooking's mistake. The emotional path is a train of thought. If the heavens have feelings, they will grow old. If you, the god of cooking, have feelings, even if your cultivation base is mighty and you become a supreme ancestral god, you can only be an old man. After you die of old age, you will decay. If you want to be immortal, you must be ruthless. Soul God said coldly. With his hands clasped behind his back, he walked step by step toward the mist. As he walked, the mist seemed to have encountered something it feared and began to retreat. In the mist, Neo-Han-san, who had breathed a sigh of relief, held 80 in his arms. Suddenly, his hair stood on end. F*CKU. Is there no end to this? There was grief and indignation in Neo-Hansen's eyes. As the mist receded, he continued to walk deeper into the mist with 80 in his arms. He did not want to go. There was danger in the depths of the mist. He was afraid that if he went in, he would not be able to come back. However, when he looked behind him, the mist receded. There seemed to be a faintly discernible silhouette slowly walking out of it. That feeling was really terrifying. With no other choice, Neo-Han-san could only walk into the mist. As he walked, the mist gradually became thicker and thicker. In the end, it seemed to turn into droplets of liquid floating in the air. The deeper he went, the more difficult it was for Neo-Han-san to walk. The flow of time and space seemed to have become very slow. Where's this place? Owner Boo, come and save me. Earth. Bu Fong, who was fishing with his eyes closed, suddenly opened his eyes. There was a look of surprise and bewilderment in his eyes. The sky was vast, and the wilderness was vast, lush green grass, and a simple wooden house. There seemed to be countless scenes flashing rapidly in Bufong's eyes. Just now, at a certain moment, he seemed to have heard Nyo Hansen's cry, and that cry reminded him of Nyo Hansen and the heaven and earth farmland. The wooden house, the flowing water, the green grass, Nyo Hansen lying on the recliner, snoring loudly. The corner of Su Fu's mouth twitched. He had actually forgotten such a familiar scene. If he removed Nyo Hansen from the scene, wasn't that the place where the god of cooking and the queen of curses lived in seclusion? That was the farmland that Bufong had been looking for all this time. Rumble. A powerful aura suddenly exploded out of Bufong's body. The pupils of the experts who were searching all over the ancestral planet constricted. Tongtan, Yuan Shi Tianduan, Lady Nuwa, Lord Go, Hades Era, Mu Hongzi, and the others all gathered. Rumble. The still surface of the ocean suddenly sank under the pressure. One terrifying expert after another hovered midair. Looking at these familiar faces, Bufong could not help but breathe a sigh of relief. I know where Soul God's heart is. Chapter 1844. Oh, Bufong's words gave everyone pause. Where is Soul God's heart? Tong Tian frowned. He was a little anxious. It had been too long. There was an inexplicable uneasiness in his heart. They had no idea what Soul God had been doing all this time. It was as if the enemy was in the dark and they were in the light. Bufong's face was calm. He took off his bamboo hat. Assemble the army, he said. Bufong said. Many people present were taken aback. Assemble the army. It seems that Bufong is really sure of Soul God's location. Otherwise, he would not have assembled the army first. Tong Tian looked at Bufong. Without hesitation, he immediately ordered the army to assemble. Immortal music lingered in the air. The immortals on the ancestral planet soared into the sky. A neat and orderly army had gathered in the sky. Cultivation was no longer a secret on the ancestral star. Everyone looked up at the rainbow radiance in the sky, and they were all in awe. Bufong took off his bamboo hat and his straw raincoat. He walked slowly. It was a problem that he had always ignored, and now he was reminded of it. In fact, Soul God was the god of cooking. Even if the god of cooking really hid Soul God's heart, he would always sense it. So if Soul God's heart was really on the ancestral planet, it was impossible for Soul God not to come. Judging from the calm situation on the ancestral planet, Soul God's heart was not here. Bufong sighed. He had accidentally been tricked by the god of cooking. Bufong's expression was somewhat complicated. The army of immortals was very efficient, and they gathered in no time. However, Bufong did not wait for them. Little Hu and Xiaopi landed on Bufong's shoulders. Bufong looked at his friends behind him and nodded. The next moment, his aura filled the air. He took a step forward, and a white dot of light turned into a passage in front of him. In an instant, they stepped into the starry sky of the universe and disappeared. Lord Goyu, Hades Era, and the others quickly followed. Tong Tian stepped into the teleportation array with the 4 immortal slaying swords on his back. However, he had left a clue for the immortal army. He followed Bufong. There seemed to be a streak of light flashing through the boundless starry sky. It stretched across the sky. This is the primeval universe. Tong Tian followed Bufong's pace. He couldn't help but ask as he looked at the boundless starry sky flying past him. Bufong nodded. It was indeed the primitive universe. Sect leader Tong Tian said nothing. Soul God's heart was not hidden on the ancestral planet. Could it be hidden in some remote corner? This made him a little puzzled and confused. However, he believed in Bufong's judgment. If there was anyone in the world who could know where Soul God was, it would be Bufong. Boom! The streak of light streaked across the sky as if they were walking in the universe. The experts present were all very strong, so it was not difficult for them to cross the starry sky. They crossed one star field after another. Finally, after a long time, Tong Tian furrowed his brows. He sensed an incomparably powerful fluctuation. That fluctuation caused his eyes to turn solemn all of a sudden. Sure enough, Bufong said faintly. He pulled the string and sped up again. The space around him flowed very fast, and with every step he took, he seemed to cross millions of miles. Boom! Finally, he arrived at a desolate star field. Bufong slowed down. In fact, even without Bufong's guidance, the people present could see the unusual scene in front of them. In the distance, there were 7 stars. They floated quietly. Generally speaking, the distribution of stars formed a certain pattern under the control of the will of the Great Path. However, the 7 stars in front of them were forcibly moved by a powerful force. Bufong stopped and looked at the 7 stars in the distance. Behind the 7 stars was a continent. It was surrounded by a magical gray fog. This feeling, is this the heaven and earth farmland? Mu Hongzi said in surprise. He had owned a heaven and earth farmland before, so he could naturally feel it. The Heaven Chief Realm was his farmland, and all the candidates for the god of cooking had a heaven and earth farmland. The gray world in front of him gave him the same feeling as his relationship with the immortal cooking realm. That's right. This is the heaven and earth farmland. Bufong looked at it with a somewhat complicated look in his eyes. This is my heaven and earth farmland, Bufong said. Mu Hongzi's pupils constricted. Could it be? But that shouldn't be the case. Every host has a heaven and earth farmland. So why did the god of cooking hide the soul god's heart in Bufong's heaven and earth farmland? Bufong did not explain Mu Hongzi's doubts. In fact, Bufong only had one thought. However, he was not sure. But there was no doubt that the soul god's heart must be hidden in his heaven and earth farmland. This could be seen from the 7 stars in front of him. Tong Tian's pupils constricted. So the soul god's heart is hidden in that great world. Tong Tian's eyes narrowed. Then, the 4 immortal slaughtering swords behind him moved. They left their sheaths in a flash and tore through the sky. His aura fluctuated as he stepped on the starry sky and sped toward the 7 stars in the distance. Rumble. Sure enough, the moment he made his move, from one of the 7 stars, a burst of pure energy that was close to the power of great sins surged out. Pride Great Soul Overlord's eyes were cold and ruthless. The 4 immortal slaughtering swords turned into an array and smashed down. A dazzling aura exploded out of Pride Great Soul Overlord as well. A beam of light shot out, as if to tear the sky apart. Then a black spear collided with the array. The auras of 2 perfected saints collided and exploded. The 4 immortal slaying swords flew back and hovered around Tong Tian's body. Tong Tian stepped on the stars, his Taoist robe flapping noisily in the wind. A perfected great soul overlord. Sure enough, the soul god is here. Tong Tian's eyes burst into a dazzling light, and his killing intent soared into the sky. Found it. He finally found the soul god's hiding place. Tong Tian let out a long roar. Holding the Qingping sword in his hand, he charged over with the 4 immortal slaughtering swords. He fought fiercely with Pride Great Soul Overlord. This battle was earth-shattering, causing the sky to dim and the earth to dim. Countless stars in the surroundings were shattered by the impact. The Great Soul Overlords on the other 6 stars were still sitting cross-legged and motionless. What are they doing? Lord Go asked Bufong, somewhat puzzled. Bufong shook his head. He could not figure it out either. The 7 Great Soul Overlords were here to protect the Soul God, so that he could complete the task of obtaining the heart. Therefore, they could not afford to waste time here. Do it, Bufong said. His voice faded away. He was the first to move, taking a step forward. Like a meteor, he rushed toward the heaven and earth farmland. When he returned to the mortal world, Bufong had separated the farmland from it. To tell the truth, the current farmland had little to do with him. However, he still had many old friends in the farmland. So, he had to kill his way in. Bufong moved. Lord Go, Hades Era, Xiaobai, and you also moved. One expert after another turned into streams of light and rushed toward the farmland. However, as they charged forward, The remaining 6 great soul overlords sitting cross-legged on the lonely stars opened their eyes at the same time. The expressions on their faces were different, and in an instant, their bodies assumed strange poses. Rumble. Streams of sinful power intertwined with each other. With a rumble, they turned into the shadow of a huge fiend. That phantom was incomparably huge. Pride Great Soul Overlord, who was fighting with Tontian, narrowed his eyes and retreated abruptly. He returned to the stars. The sinful power turned into black dragons and rushed into the sky. 7 black dragons wheeled in the sky. Then, they turned into a terrifying array. As soon as the array appeared, everyone's expression changed. Boom! It seemed to have turned into a boundless black hole. In a flash, it sucked everyone into it. Whether it was Bufong, Nethery, or Tontian, they were all sucked into it. Behind the black hole, the 7 great soul overlords sat cross-legged. The sinful power in them surged. A black crystal was wheeling over their heads. Bufong frowned. He walked in the boundless darkness. Where's this? He had been sucked into this boundless black hole by the array formed by the 7 great soul overlords. Are they deliberately stalling for time? Bufong took a deep breath. The 7 great soul overlords are stalling for time. As long as the soul god gets the heart, everything will be over. It looks like I have to speed up. Bufong's face was expressionless. He walked forward step by step. It's good that the black hole is broken. Bufong raised his head slightly. With a thought in his mind, the next moment, a terrible mental force surged out of his body. Like a bright lamp, it began to devour the darkness. It kept devouring everything. Suddenly, waves of black chi surged up. Bufong paused. He discovered that the floating black aura had actually transformed into 7 mirrors around him. The 7 mirrors surrounded him in the middle, blocking off all his escape routes. What are they going to do? Bufong paused. He took a step forward and approached a huge mirror that towered into the sky. The mirror was not a mirror, so Bufong's figure was not distorted. The mirror reflected Bufong's figure. The background was boundless darkness, but Bufong's figure in the mirror was extremely bright. What array is this? 7 mirrors in the black hole. Bufong raised his hand. Bufong's figure in the mirror did the same. He reached out and touched the mirror. A cold feeling was transmitted into Bufong's skin through the mirror. Bufong frowned. Bufong's figure in the mirror also frowned. Well, Bufong stared at himself in the mirror with a straight face. He looked at it quietly. The atmosphere gradually became stagnant. Bufong's figure in the mirror also looked at himself. Suddenly, Bufong's figure in the mirror slightly raised the corner of his mouth and his head, revealing an arrogant expression. He opened his mouth and spat out a word. Die. Clap, 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 clap. All the mirrors lit up. There were 7 Bufong's figures in the 7 mirrors. Each of Bufong's figure had a different posture. Some showed a jealous posture. Some showed a lazy posture. It seemed that the emotions of the 7 major sins were vividly expressed at this moment. Bufong took a step back. The corner of his mouth twitched. He was afraid that his expression for the rest of his life was reflected in these 7 mirrors. In the heaven and earth farmland, in a misty gray fog, Soul God walked slowly. He was neither fast nor slow. As he walked, the gray fog seemed to keep retreating. However, there was a limit to it. When it retreated to its limit, he could no longer retreat. Bam! The gray fog seemed to rebound and instantly engulfed and wrapped Soul God. However, Soul God's figure was not affected by the gray fog at all. He walked slowly. Finally, they arrived in front of a field shrouded in gray. It was a familiar wooden hut, a familiar turf, and even a familiar spirit beast on a familiar little tree. It was the place where the god of cooking and the queen of curses had lived. Neo-Han-san held 80 and the 3-eyed wild lion in his arms, looking terrified. Damn it, Soul God really chased me here? I hid in the gray fog, but I still can't stop Soul God. I'm finished. I'm going to be made into beef jerky. Neo-Hansen's heart was filled with fear. However, Soul God ignored him. He stared quietly at the wooden hut in the distance with his scarlet eyes. The atmosphere seemed to freeze in an instant. Neo Hansen glanced at Soul God, then at the wooden hut. He exhaled and prepared to leave the gray fog with 80 and the others. However, he had just taken a step forward. Creak, the door of the wooden hut, which seemed to be still in the gray fog, was pushed open. That sound made Neo Hansen's hair stand on end. Damn it, there's someone in this wooden hut. Chapter 1845. There's someone in the cabin? Neo Hansen was startled, and his body, which was about to escape, froze on the spot. In the distance, Soul God did not seem to notice Neo Hansen at all. His scarlet eyes stared at the wooden house. His movements were neither fast nor slow as he strode towards the wooden house. Neo Hansen was so nervous that beads of sweat rolled down his forehead. He could not believe that someone would come out of this cabin, which looked like it had been abandoned for countless years. Who could it be? He had to suppress the terrible pressure brought by Soul God. Neo Hansen slowly turned his head and saw the figure walking out of the cabin. The interior of the cabin was old, and a figure with a head covered in fog walked out. The fog was somewhat similar to the gray fog in the heaven and earth farmland. It was equally mysterious and unfathomable. This as Neo Hansen's eyes widened. He did not recognize this figure. Of course, if Bufong were here, he would certainly recognize him, because Bufong was no stranger to this figure. Soul God looked indifferently at the figure. The figure with the head covered in fog was also looking at Soul God. They seemed to be communicating with each other with their eyes. With 80 in his arms, Neo Hansen slowly walked out of the fog, moving quietly little by little. He hoped that Soul God did not notice him, but it was obvious that he was thinking too much. The moment he was about to step out of the fog, Soul God raised his hand. Wisps of black power of the great sins spread in an instant and wrapped around his arms and feet. It was as if a cage had appeared and completely sealed Neo Hansen in it. Neo Hansen's eyes widened. He was bound where he was. "Did I let you go?" Soul God said indifferently. His words were devoid of any emotion. Neo Hansen wanted to cry, but no tears came out. Why do you have to involve a nobody like me in a fight between the big shots? However, Soul God did not kill Neo Hansen. After sealing him up, he faced the figure standing in front of the wooden hut again. The corners of Soul God's mouth slowly curved upward. The figure whose head was shrouded in mist walked out against the immense pressure. He was facing the Soul God. That old god of cooking hid my heart here. Did he think I wouldn't find it? Soul God sneered. I sent you to guard my heart. The figure seemed to let out a faint laugh. The latter raised his hand and made a starting gesture. He was neither servile nor overbearing. The god of cooking expected that you would come, so he left me here to stop you. A faint voice resounded in the environment. Neo Hansen had already given up struggling. Since he couldn't break free, he could only quietly watch the big boss's performance. Boom! Soul God smiled coldly. He raised a hand and raised it. The wooden house that had stood still for countless years began to crumble. The grass was sent flying, and the trees were broken. It was as if they had been erased by the darkness. Neo Hansen's heart seemed to stop beating. The pressure was so great that he could not describe it with words. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the sky was falling and the earth was splitting. The figure in front of the wooden hut was still moving, not dodging or evading. In an instant, it was engulfed by the endless darkness. With a bang, it completely exploded. Neo Hansen was dumbfounded. He was defeated just like that. He had thought it was a king, but it turned out to be a bronze. Suddenly, Neo Hansen's breathing stopped. He found that a speck of light had quietly emerged from the darkness, drifting between heaven and earth like a firefly. The darkness instantly surged back. The figure whose head was shrouded in mist slowly raised his hand. A clone of the god of cooking's will? Soul God narrowed his eyes and looked indifferently at the figure emitting a dazzling light. No, I am me, a different kind of firework. Please call me Lord Bird, the figure said faintly. Then, with a wave of his hand, countless beams of light swept through the darkness and surged towards Soul God. At this moment, It was as if the god of cooking had really descended. In a black hole, Bufong looked at the 7 mirrors that surrounded him. The look on his face was a little strange. In these mirrors, Bufong was making all kinds of postures. Perhaps this was the mirror of sin, which could find out the ugly side of everyone's heart. Sin and emotion. These were all human nature. If one suppressed emotion and cut off emotion, the evil side would be infinitely magnified. For example, the god of cooking had chosen the ruthless path, so his evil side was infinitely magnified and became the 7 great sins. He became soul god. Although Bufong now walked the emotional path, he had not really reached the path yet. So the mirrors found out his 7 great sins. It seemed that they wanted to use the 7 great sins to deal with Bufong. Bufong looked at his different postures in the 7 mirrors. The corner of Bufong's mouth twitched slightly. In the mirror, the 7 Bufongs slowly walked out of it with different postures. The surface of the mirror rippled like water. Soon, the 7 figures floated around Bufong. Everyone had the 7 great sins in their heart. It depended on whether you could suppress the evil thoughts in your heart. Bufong looked at them indifferently. His mind flickered. The white tiger heaven stove, the dragon bone kitchen knife, the black turtle constellation wok, and the other god of cooking sets emerged. He ignited the divine flame. He began to cook. The 7 great sins approached Bufong step by step. However, Bufong was not nervous at all. Instead, he became calmer and more relaxed. Then, he began to cook without any distracting thoughts. As Bufong cooked, once the 7 great sins approached Bufong, he found that his body began to melt like particles. While cooking, Bufong did not have any evil thoughts. It was as if he had really reached the emotional path. Of course, this state only existed when he was cooking. At the same time, in other areas of the black hole, battles continued to break out. Sect leader Tong Tian fought against 7 enemies alone. He alone fought against his own 7 great sins. This battle was so intense that the heavens and the earth turned dark. Lord Go, Hades' era, you, and the others were fighting. Of course, there was one exception. That was Xiao Bai. Xiao Bai's mechanical eyes flashed as he looked at the 7 great sins in the mirror. He could not help but raise his hand and touch his round head. Although he was reflected in the mirror, he did not have the 7 great sins like the others. After all, Xiao Bai was just a puppet. It was a puppet that Bufong had condensed with the star origin. He had no sinful thoughts or even emotions. Of course, it could breed emotions, but at least at this moment, Xiao Bai did not have the 7 great sins. Therefore, after looking at himself in the mirror for a while, Xiao Bai could not find a way out. His mechanical eyes burst out with golden light. He directly punched the mirror. The terrifying punch contained the mighty force that could fight against Soul God. The 7 mirrors were smashed to pieces. Clang! Countless broken pieces fell to the ground. There was a great soul overlord sitting cross-legged behind each mirror. They looked at Xiao Bai in astonishment. Xiao Bai tilted his head. Golden waves of air burst out behind him. In an instant, he was fighting with the 7 great soul overlords. Even though he was fighting 7 great soul overlords alone, Xiao Bai was not weaker. It did not matter at all. Boom! The battle broke out. Bufong finished cooking. The power of the 7 great sins was also approaching him. Bufong shook the wok. A rich aroma lingered in the air. He poured the sauce in the wok onto the 7 dishes in a row. The 7 glowing dishes were finished by Bufong. He flicked his fingers. The 7 dishes shot out separately. They turned into streams of light and whistled in 7 different directions. Each dish was very simple, and the ingredients used were ordinary, but they contained Bufong's current understanding of cooking and the emotional path. He had bred the 7 emotions into the 7 dishes. Xiao Bai was fighting the 7 great soul overlords. After all, each of these 7 great soul overlords was a perfected saint. They were fighting. Xiao Bai did not have the upper hand. The 7 great soul overlords stared at the black crystal over their heads. At the same time, the golden origin of stars seemed to emerge over Xiao Bai's head. Boom! All of a sudden, the 7 dishes seemed to turn into 7 streams of light as they sped toward the 7 great soul overlords. The 7 great soul overlords never thought that the dishes would suddenly appear. Of course, even if they had thought of it, they would not have been able to resist it. The 7 dishes contained Bufong's 7 emotions. Of course, even if they had thought of it, they would not have been able to resist it. The 7 dishes contained Bufong's 7 emotions. The great soul overlords retreated at high speed. Their faces were filled with unwillingness and fear. However, under the suppression of the dish, it was gradually sealed, just like the soul god of 1,000 years ago. However, Bufong was no longer the Bufong of old. It might be difficult to seal the soul god, but it was not a problem to seal the 7 great soul overlords. After all, the dishes Bufong cooked were almost comparable to the dishes of a pseudo-god of cooking. At last, the 7 great soul overlords could no longer resist. His body turned into black smoke and disappeared. He was absorbed by the golden light falling from each dish. Each dish was like a world of its own, suppressing a great soul overlord and a perfected chaotic saint. The 7 dishes hovered in midair, each with a crystal hovering under it. Beneath each crystal, there was a faintly discernible black aura. From time to time, the black aura would turn into human faces. Xiao Bai touched his round head. His mechanical eyes flashed. In the distance, with his hands clasped behind him, Bufong walked slowly toward him. He was simple, elegant, and calm. After returning to the mortal world, Bufong's state of mind had transcended too much. The 7 great soul overlords were suppressed. Even the black hole began to quietly fade away. The figures that had been covered by the black hole began to emerge one after another. Everyone was still in a state of shock from the great battle. Tongtian's face was full of astonishment. You, Lord Go, and the others were also shocked. What's going on? Lord Go asked. Bufong smiled and pointed at the 7 dishes hovering in midair. The 7 dishes were the 7 great soul overlords. These are the 7 strongest subordinates of the soul god. Now they are all sealed in these dishes. Bufong said. This was good news for the experts present. The black hole faded away. Everyone's eyes fell on the great Tianyuan world, which was shrouded in gray mist. For Bufong was his farmland. Even though it had been stripped away, Bufong would never forget the aura of its origin. The god of cooking had hidden the soul god's heart in the heaven and earth farmland. Bufong took a deep breath. He had never thought of this. Rumble. Suddenly, in the heaven and earth farmland, suddenly an earth-shattering collision occurred. Terrifying energy fluctuations surged out, blowing away the surrounding gray fog, causing it to surge. Sensing the collision of these two forces, the expressions of all the experts present, including Bufong, changed. It's the soul god. Chapter 1846. It was indeed soul god. Everyone couldn't help but think of this in their hearts as their expressions changed drastically. Soul god was really here, which meant that he was only one step away from finding his heart. Everyone felt a chill run down their spines. If they had been a little slower, they might have faced the perfect soul god who had fused with his heart. A cultivation at the ancestral god realm wasn't something that anyone present could deal with, and even Bufong couldn't do it. Therefore, all the experts, including sect leader Tong Tian, sped away at top speed. They rushed toward the great Tianyuan world below. What they had to do now was to stop Soul God. Bufong frowned. Sensing the terrible fluctuations that erupted in the void, he could not help but exhale. With a flash, he streaked across the void toward the heaven and earth farmland. He had landed in the farmland countless times, but he never thought that he would come in such a manner. Nyohan-san felt his breath catch in his throat. He hugged 80 tightly and resisted the terrible energy impact. Soul God, the god of cooking, the two strongest existences in the universe actually collided at this moment. Lord Bird was the clone of the god of cooking's will, just like Kersey was the queen of curses. Perhaps even Bufong did not expect this. After all, in Bufong's opinion, Lord Bird's cultivation base was mysterious, but not very strong. Boom! Now, as Lord Bird unleashed his full power, a mighty aura swept out. The gray fog seemed to be washed away. However, the wooden hut behind Lord Bird seemed to be protected by a mysterious energy, so it was not swept away by the impact of the collision. The gray fog continued to sweep and attack. Neo Hansen shivered. Soul God's scarlet eyes were full of rage. His anger toward the god of cooking was even stronger than that toward Bufong. Although Bufong had sealed him for 1,000 years. However, compared to having his heart dug out by the god of cooking, being sealed for 1,000 years was nothing. Even if it was just a clone of the god of cooking's will, Soul God would never let it go. Every time he attacked, it seemed to cause the heavens and the earth to tremble. Lord Bird's body radiated golden light as his divine power tangled with Soul God's power of the great sins. However, even though the explosion was terrifying, it was not a big deal. However, within the gray fog, all of the explosive energy seemed to be absorbed and unable to be released. Therefore, outside the heaven and earth farmland, everything was calm, and there was no scene of everything being destroyed because of the great battle. Perhaps this was the god of cooking's arrangement. The gray fog had a mystical power. Outside the gray fog, Tontian and the other experts landed one after another. Outside the gray mist, they were extremely vigilant. The explosion and energy that erupted from the gray mist made them extremely shocked. Bufong also came. The experts spread out to make way for Bufong. With his hands behind his back, Bufong stepped on the grass and came before the gray fog. Bufong had a complicated expression on his face as he stared at the endless gray fog. His eyes flickered continuously. After a long time, he sighed. He sensed the aura of the expert who was fighting Soul God. It was an acquaintance. The god of cooking, or rather, Lord Bird. It turned out that the god of cooking had already arranged everything. Every host had a heaven and earth farmland, which was not only their back garden and a place to store ingredients, but also the place where the god of cooking had been hiding. His test for the host, if the host could meet his requirements. The god of cooking would place the wooden hut where he had lived with the queen of curses and Soul God's heart here. Mu Hongzi had chosen to give up the god of cooking's inheritance. Perhaps it was because he sensed that someone in the Heaven Chief realm was spying on him and felt that the inheritance was a conspiracy. This was probably the reason why he gave up on inheriting the god of cooking's inheritance. After so many generations of hosts, only Bufong had truly met the god of cooking's requirements. Now, Soul God had found the heart and the heaven and earth farmland. The god of cooking had probably left a deep pit for Soul God. Bufong sighed. He did not make a move. Tong Tian and the others were a little anxious. Aren't we going in? If Soul God gets the heart, none of us will be able to escape. However, Bufong was still unmoved. He was waiting for the god of cooking's backup plan. Since the god of cooking had done this, he must have a purpose. Rumble. A loud rumble rang out. The gray mist suddenly bulged. It expanded in an instant as if it would explode at any moment. All the immortals and deities took a step back and watched in horror. As time went by, the great army Tontian had deployed had gathered in the area. Outside the heaven and earth farmland, in the boundless starry sky, numerous immortals and deities hovered in the starry sky, and the whole sky was surrounded by them. At this moment, the desolate star field became extremely lively. In the star field, the top experts on some of the planets with lives were horrified. They had no idea what was going on. Bufong looked at the swelling gray mist. He reached out his hand and touched it. The gray mist was in the shape of tiny particles, each of which was extremely small, but they contained a strange energy which was close to the power of an ancestor god. Bufong suddenly understood. No wonder Nyo Hansan could get the ability to hybridize. It turned out that it came from the gray mist. The gray mist contained the power of Soul God's heart, which belonged to the ancestor god realm and was used by the god of cooking. Of course, the use was insignificant. In the depths of the gray mist, Soul God's eyes were cold. 7 spears emerged behind him, each of which was engraved with patterns that represented the power of the great sins. The 7 sins had become his strongest weapons. He, Soul God, walked the ruthless path. Even though he had lost his heart, he was still very strong. The clone of Lord Birds was having a hard time resisting. Rumble. He was blasted back into the wooden hut by Soul God. Lord Bird did not fly out again. He seemed to have fallen silent. Nyohan San held 80 in his arms, filled with despair. With the 7 spears on his back, Soul God walked slowly, step by step. He walked to the front of the wooden hut. He reached out a hand. He placed it on the handle of the door. Suddenly, from within the wooden hut, a glowing palm pressed against the door. With a creak, the door was pushed open. The glowing figure of a middle-aged man emerged. It was none other than the god of cooking. Lord Bird had completely activated the god of cooking's power. In this way, he could obtain great power. But once the light of power faded, he would wither and decay. Perhaps this was fate. Lord Bird sighed. After all, he was not lucky enough to become a respectable person like Kersey. Suddenly, a dazzling light surged. The next moment, it engulfed Soul God. It was so dazzling that Nyohan San could not help but close his eyes. Suddenly, when Nyohan San closed his eyes, he seemed to vaguely see a familiar figure in the gray mist in the distance. The gray mist parted and could not touch Bufong's body. Bufong and Xiaobai walked in. The others were outside. It was not that they did not want to come in, but that they could not. The gray mist blocked them, preventing them from taking a step inside. Except for Bufong and Xiaobai. Even Tong Tian, Lord Go, and the others could not step inside. Because they did not belong to the heaven and earth farmland. They were not recognized by the gray mist. They were not like Nyohan San, 80, and the others who lived in the heaven and earth farmland every day and breathed the power of the gray mist. Therefore, it was not difficult to enter the gray mist. And Bufong was the original master of the heaven and earth farmland. As for Xiaobai, he was just a puppet. Bufong looked at Soul God in the distance, who was wrapped in golden light. His eyes narrowed slightly. He took a deep breath. Just now, Bufong figured out what the god of cooking's backup plan was. It was not an array at all. The god of cooking's backup plan was him, Bufong. As for Lord Bird, he was only there to slow down Soul God. The heaven and earth farmland, the gray mist, and Lord Bird were all arranged to make Bufong the backup plan. Now, he was the only one who could fight Soul God. Only Bufong could stop Soul God from taking back his heart. Honor Bu, he's coming back to life. Tears streamed down Neo Hansen's face as he suddenly shouted. In a trance, he seemed to see Bufong. At first, he thought it was an illusion. But on second thought, it did not seem quite right. Holding back the urge to cry, he opened his eyes and saw Bufong. The familiar figure was looking at the golden light in front of the wooden hut with his hands clasped behind his back. For some reason, Nyohan San was moved. Honorbu was not dead. Illuminated by the golden light, Bufong's figure looked like a god who had come to save him. I'm so moved. Bufong saw Nyohan San and 80 in Nyo Hansen's arms. He raised his eyebrows slightly. He took a step. He appeared in front of Nyohan San, as if the ground had shrunk to an inch. He raised his hand and patted Nyohan San on the shoulder. He exerted a little force. Soul God's restraint was torn apart in an instant, and Nyohan San was thrown out of the gray mist. Nyohan San was in midair, holding 80 in his arms. He felt an inexplicable sense of relief in his heart. The gray mist swirled. Nyohan San was thrown out. Meanwhile, Bufong looked seriously at the wooden hut again. The light in the wooden hut began to slowly dissipate. Lord Bird's body gradually withered. He took a few steps back and sat down on the ground. Soul God glanced indifferently at Lord Bird with his scarlet eyes. You want to stop me with just a clone of your consciousness? Soul God did not take it seriously. He turned his head and glanced at Bufong in the distance. The scarlet in his eyes was like flowing water. There was also a hint of excitement in them. Then, he turned around and stepped into the wooden hut. Bufong frowned. He took a step forward and walked quickly toward the wooden hut. Xiao Bai's mechanical eyes flashed. He was going to follow. However, after Bufong entered the wooden hut, Lord Bird's withered body was lifted out by Bufong's power. Xiao Bai raised his huge palm and caught Lord Bird. He almost stripped him subconsciously. Fortunately, he held back. After putting Lord Bird down, Lord Bird glanced at Xiao Bai with cloudy eyes and said gratefully, "Thank you." Xiao Bai did not respond. His mechanical eyes turned to the wooden hut. Inside the wooden hut, Bufong, Soul God, and the God of Cooking were all there. Chapter 1847. Inside the wooden hut. Everything seemed to be still. A pale blue light illuminated everything in the wooden hut. It was a simple wooden hut, no different from a mortal's house. Ordinary wood, ordinary tables, chairs, bowls, and chopsticks. Except for being spotless, there was nothing magical about it. Bufong frowned and looked around at everything in the wooden hut. Inside the wooden hut, Soul God and the God of Cooking were gone. It seemed that he was the only one left in the whole hut. He took a step forward, and the sound of his footsteps echoed in the wooden hut. Bufong paused. The footsteps were not only his, but also someone else's. Soul God? Bufong frowned. He lowered his eyes and looked around, but he still did not see any trace of Soul God. It was as if the two of them were in different dimensions since they stepped into the wooden hut. He could hear Soul God's footsteps, and Soul God could hear his as well. Bufong stopped, and so did Soul God. The whole room was deathly silent. Soul God's heart is in this wooden hut. Bufong frowned. He looked on quietly, his gaze indifferently sweeping across the crowd. Tables, chairs, beds, cabinets. Bufong's eyes fell in every direction, trying to find the hidden heart of Soul God. Of course, Bufong also knew that the God of Cooking would not put the heart on display so conspicuously. In this simple room, Bufong sensed more than one familiar aura. It was the aura of the system and the God of Cooking's menu. The system had completely disappeared since Bufong returned to the mortal world. Bufong thought it had really disappeared, but now it seemed that the system had appeared in this wooden hut. Or could it be that the system had always been here? The God of Cooking system was, in fact, the incarnation of Soul God's heart. After figuring this out, Bufong could not help but admire the God of Cooking, who had been using Soul God's power to cultivate a weapon to restrain him. Of course, this was just Bufong's guess. Bufong sat cross-legged on the ground. The sound of hurried footsteps rang out in his ears. Clearly, Soul God, who had been unable to find his heart, was flustered and exasperated. He seemed to run wildly through the room, destroying everything in it. Bufong opened his eyes quietly and listened attentively, as if he was listening to a farce. After a long time, suddenly, there was complete silence. Bufong narrowed his eyes. Boom! The space suddenly began to tremble like water. Within the pale blue radiance, a pitch-black face suddenly appeared in front of him. The eyes on the face opened, and countless sinful emotions floated in them. It was like a whirlpool that wanted to suck one's soul into it and devour everything. Found you, Soul God said coldly. He broke through the dimensional barrier created by the wooden house and appeared in front of Bufong. Bufong opened his eyes indifferently and looked at Soul God. So what if you found me? I've never hidden myself. Just because you found me doesn't mean you found my heart, Bufong said. Bufong's voice was very calm, but it was this calmness that made Soul God furious. The heart is in this room. Where the hell is it? Soul God growled. He was the combination of the 7 great sins. He was very tyrannical and fierce. However, Bufong just looked at him indifferently. His calmness and madness formed a sharp contrast. Boom! The barrier was completely torn apart. The pale blue in front of Bufong's eyes completely faded away. At this moment, the quiet room was completely turned into ruins. Everything was fragmented and destroyed by Soul God. Bufong glanced at the dilapidated room and shook his head. Soul God's scarlet eyes burst into boundless rage. He suddenly raised his hand and slapped at Bufong. A terrible aura suddenly erupted. However, before it could approach Bufong's face, it gradually dissipated. It seems that, from this moment on, this room is in a forbidden state, just like the ability Xiao Bai once possessed. The corners of Bu Fang's mouth curved upward slightly. He raised his hand and blocked Soul God's move. Bu Fang's calm look infuriated Soul God. Bu Fang was not surprised. In the past, Xiao Bai's ability came from the system, which made Bu Fang even more certain that the system was in this room. Xiao Bai was the carrier of the god of cooking's will, and he had sealed Soul God. The system disappeared together with the god of cooking's will. When Xiao Bai died, so did Bu Fang. After Bu Fang was resurrected, the first person he came into contact with was Lord Bird. Lord Bird was the clone of the god of cooking's will, so it was most likely that he brought the system back here. The place where the god of cooking created the system had finally returned to. Perhaps all of this was fated to happen. Do you think all this can trap me? Soul God sneered, his scarlet eyes gleaming with a brutal gleam. Even if all this is set up by that old god of cooking, with my current strength, it can't trap me for long. Soul God's eyes were ferocious. When I break this shabby house and find the heart, the first person I'll kill will be you, stinking chef, Soul God said coldly. He really hated Bu Fang. The Soul Demon universe was planted with flowers and grass. The army of soul demons was sealed, and even the soul overlords of the seven sins were sealed. Bu Fang was against him in every way. He was like a fishbone in his throat, making him very uncomfortable. So, you also admit that you were trapped. The corners of Bu Fang's mouth twitched slightly. He looked playfully at Soul God. Soul God paused. You see, in this room now, there are only you and me, and the god of cooking's dead will. So, Bu Fang said, so what do you want? Soul God's eyes widened as he stared at Bu Fang incredulously. What did this stinking chef want to do to him? I'm Soul God. F***CKU. The corner of Bu Fang's mouth twitched. However, he was too lazy to pay attention to the furious Soul God. He looked up and glanced around. You disrespectful old man. What do you think I want to do to you? Bu Fang rolled his eyes. The god of cooking deliberately created an environment for us to be alone because he wanted to use me to get rid of you, Bu Fang said, standing up and patting the wrinkles on his vermilion robe. Get rid of me? With just you? When Soul God heard that, he breathed a sigh of relief and sneered. I admit that you, chef, have grown a lot in 1,000 years. But you courted death by taking the emotional path. Do you know what the emotional path is? Do you know why that old fool chose the ruthless path as his main path? It's because he once took the emotional path and failed. It's because he failed that I'm here. Only my ruthless path can set foot on the true peak. You, who took the emotional path, can't escape the fate of failure. And now, you can't beat me. In this room, both you and I are forbidden from using magic. Don't tell me. You want to fight me hand to hand? Soul God sneered. He was the Soul God, a combination of sinful emotions. Although he was violent and manic, he was not stupid. Bu Fang rubbed his fists. I'm a chef. Why would I do such a rude thing? Bu Fang's face was expressionless. Bam! The next moment, the vermilion robe fluttered. Bu Fang threw a punch and hit Soul God in the face. Dumbfounded, Soul God took 2 or 3 steps back. Of course I choose to influence you with my cooking. This is exactly what the god of cooking wants. Otherwise, do you think I'm the one standing here? If it's a hand-to-hand fight, Xiao Bai is more suitable than me to beat you. Bu Fang flicked his palm and said faintly. Soul God got to his feet, his scarlet eyes almost bursting with flames. What kind of F***king chef are you? Soul God cursed. He had such a bad temper, but it was not his fault. He was a combination of sinful emotions. Bu Fang twitched the corner of his mouth coldly. Then his mind flickered. Slowly, the god of cooking set emerged. The dragon bone kitchen knife, the Chilean transmigration ladle, the black turtle constellation wok, the white tiger heaven stove, the vermilion robe. In this room, the god of cooking sets were not hindered. Thus, the moment Bu Fang summoned the god of cooking sets, the aura in the room changed abruptly. In every corner of the room, one array after another emerged. Each array seemed to be a blooming flower. They lit up every corner of a room. A serious and solemn voice suddenly sounded. Congratulations to host Bufong for triggering the last test, the god of cooking's wish. You have completed it, and your dream path to becoming the god of cooking will be completed. The system said. As Bufong watched, streams of light gathered and turned into a figure made of lines. That figure was the system. It had accompanied Bufong since the beginning, and it was now the system that had brought Bufong on the path to becoming the god of cooking. The god of cooking's menu appeared, and drops of god of cooking's divine power, liquid, fell. It made the god of cooking's menu materialize, the god of cooking's wish. The thing that the god of cooking regretted most was creating Soul God. Soul God arose because of his sins, but he could not hold on long enough to destroy Soul God. So he could only turn his hope into a wish and entrust it to his inheritor. Fulfill the god of cooking's wish, and the path to becoming the god of cooking will be completely completed. The system said seriously. Bufong exhaled. His eyes were filled with complicated emotions. The god of cooking's menu turned into an old, shabby book and fell into Bufong's hand. Bufong slowly flipped it open. There were only 7 dishes in the god of cooking's menu, and they seemed to correspond to Soul God's 7 sins. The words on it were written with painstaking effort. Bufong seemed to see an old man holding a pen under the dim light of an oil lamp, writing down the recipe word by word with a trembling hand. Was the system going to reform Soul God with a dish? Could a dish erase Soul God's sins? The corner of Bufong's mouth twitched. Was he sure it was reforming and not disgusting? The Soul God was probably the reason why soul demons hated delicious food. Come on, host. You're only one step away from success. A beautiful tomorrow is waiting for you. The system told Bufong the chicken soup that he was very familiar with in its unique, serious tone. It had been a long time since he had the system's chicken soup, and Bufong felt a little refreshed. In that case, the look in Bufong's eyes when he looked at Soul God became much gentler. We are both chefs, so let's solve it the way chefs do, Bufong said lightly. Soul God's scarlet pupils constricted. He wanted to flee, but the power of the gourmet formation descended upon him, turning into ice-cold chains that shackled his body. It prevented him from struggling out of the wooden hut. Meanwhile, Bufong grabbed the dragon bone kitchen knife. He breathed a sigh of relief. Then, he took out a velvet rope and tied his hair. Carefully, he rolled up his sleeves. It was as if he was cooking for a grand banquet. It was just that this banquet was prepared for Soul God. It was also a funeral for Soul God. It could be said that Soul God was the most comfortable villain in history, because the way he died was probably not because he was beaten to death by the protagonist. Instead, he was stuffed to death by the protagonist with food. Soul God flew into a rage. If Asterisk King fell into that cunning god of cooking's trap again. He could not help but wonder if he had really become a little stupid because of the power of sin. I am Soul God. Soul God growled. Sizzle. He did not use his divine power or any special techniques. Bufong quietly cooked according to the god of cooking's menu. The aroma lingered in the air. Soul God, who was growling, twitched his nose and shut his mouth immediately. His stomach churned. The power of the great sins turned into a black dragon and began to struggle slowly. It was fighting against the power of the gourmet array. Bufong glanced at it and sped up his cooking. Once Soul God struggled free, he would not be easy to deal with. He shook the wok and stir-fried it. The spatula flew, and the aroma filled the air. The blue and white porcelain plate was ready. Bufong poured the dish out of the wok and poured the gravy over it. Then, he came in front of Soul God. Holding the dish with his chopsticks, he nodded expressionlessly at Soul God. Be good. Open your mouth. Ah! Soul God's eyes widened. As a great villain, he wanted to die with dignity. Chapter 1848. Soul God would rather die than submit. He would never eat it. Bufong's dishes made him feel a sense of crisis. To him, food was poison, and it would wear down his power of the great sins bit by bit. It would weaken Soul God's power. This was the god of cooking's trap, and it was also the most effective way to deal with him. Soul God's eyes almost popped out of their sockets, and he kept his mouth shut. He did not believe that Bufong could stuff food into his mouth when he kept his mouth shut. Bufong looked indifferently at Soul God. His gaze was calm. The gourmet array began to surge. At this moment, the black power of the great sins, which was dispersing from Soul God's body, was being constantly suppressed. Soul God's pupils constricted. Damn the god of cooking's wool. I won't give in. Bufong sighed. In this room now, the god of cooking was invincible, even though Soul God had once touched the ancestral god realm. However, he had lost his heart, and his heart was being used by the god of cooking, who was now suppressing him. Perhaps when Soul God gradually adapted to the power of his heart, he could summon it back. However, at this moment, he could only be suppressed. Trembling, Soul God slowly raised his head and opened his mouth. His pupils constricted. Bufong picked up a spoon and scooped the food in his Soul God's mouth. Many people in the world were looking forward to his dishes. Unfortunately, there was one exception, and that was Soul God. His disgust for the food came from the depths of his soul. As soon as the food entered his mouth, Soul God felt his soul tremble. He could not even control the power of the great sins. Boom! The suppression of the gourmet array was broken. Soul God took a few steps back, clutched his head, and knelt on one knee. 7 faces appeared on his body, and every one of them was distorted. Those were the 7 deadly sins. What Bufong wanted to do was to redeem Soul God's 7 deadly sins. This was the god of cooking's plan. Now it was finally the last step. Bufong took a step back to the side of the white tiger heaven stove and looked indifferently at Soul God. Soul God clutched his head as if he had a splitting headache. His pupils constricted and his body trembled. He let out a roar and suddenly raised his head. His scarlet eyes seemed to be slackening bit by bit. The dishes cooked by Bufong. It was a recipe written by the god of cooking to deal with the 7 sins. There were 7 dishes in total, corresponding to the 7 deadly sins. As for Bufong, he only needed to cook 7 dishes to completely reform Soul God and weaken his power. Boom! Soul God let out a long cry. A force that looked like a black dragon struggled out of his body, constantly twisting and collapsing in the void with a boom. He disappeared completely. This was the Soul God's greatest sin, destruction. Bufong's face gradually turned cold. He flipped to the second page of the god of cooking's menu. It described a dish, taking out the ingredients. Bufong took his time to process them. Perhaps the god of cooking had trained his successor for all this. The god of cooking's goal was to knead his successor's cooking skills to cook the delicacies in the god of cooking's menu. Only then would he have a chance to destroy Soul God. And all this, Bufong could do it now. Bufong exhaled. He tossed the wok and cooked another dish. The rich aroma seemed to turn into golden divine dragons in the room. The golden dragons wheeled and confronted the black dragon, formed by the power of the great sins in Soul God's body, roaring and biting each other. Soul God knelt on the ground, his body bound by the chains formed by the gourmet array. Bufong looked straight ahead. All his attention was on the dish. The dishes in the god of cooking's menu were not difficult, but they required too much emotion. Only Bufong, who had embarked on the emotional path, had the chance to try them. If it were someone else, they might not have the chance to try them at all. Sizzle, he poured the dish out. It was another perfect and delicious dish. Bufong took a deep breath. The rich aroma lingered in his heart. Bufong focused his eyes. Carrying the dish, he came up to Soul God. Soul God was still resisting unyieldingly. Spoon by spoon, Bufong poured the food into Soul God's mouth, which was slowly opening. Another dish was served. Blue veins covered Soul God's body as if they were about to burst out of the blood vessels under his skin. It was a hideous scene. Soul God took a few steps back in succession. Another wisp of the power of sin in him began to crumble. Soul God's blood-colored pupils kept enlarging and shrinking, constricting. It was a kind of pain caused by the mutual promotion and suppression of attributes. That damn chef, Soul God growled. Black droplets flowed all over his body, giving off a foul stench. Bufong exhaled. He retreated to the side of the stove. He reached out a hand, opened the recipe again, and turned another page. It was another dish. The cooking was done. Bufong fed Soul God the dish. Once again, the power of sin in Soul God was stripped away and crumbled. Soul God was in great pain, and his eyes were full of anger and despair. This time, I'm really going to be killed by that old god of cooking. Bufong is the biggest conspiracy left by that old god of cooking. 1 dish, 2 dishes, 3 dishes, a total of 7 dishes. Bufong cooked unhurriedly. However, it was not easy to cook. Each dish required Bufong's tremendous mental force. Occasionally, when he finished cooking a dish, he would exhale a breath of air. Not only his mental force, but his emotions would also be vented. The god of cooking's dishes were not so easy to cook. In the room, the system floated quietly in the distance. It was like a test it had always been. It watched Bufong calmly and quietly, testing everything about Bufong. Bufong was very familiar with this feeling. The 6th dish. Bufong's forehead was covered with beads of sweat. Even with his current cultivation base, he seemed to be having a hard time. After cooking, he took a step back and sat on the ground. Controlled by an invisible force, the dish floated in front of Soul God. At this moment, Soul God was also panting heavily. He took another bite of the dish. The black color on Soul God's body had faded a lot. His body, which was as black as ink, had turned gray. His face gradually became clear and no longer blurry. Soul God fell to the ground, panting violently. He opened his mouth and let out a painful roar. Black smoke spread out of his 7 orifices, turned into a black dragon, and was torn apart by the golden dragon. Come on, host. There's only 1 dish left. The system's solemn and earnest voice of encouragement rang out. Bufong glanced at it and twitched the corner of his mouth slightly. But he was not in a hurry. He needed to rest for a while. The last dish was also the most crucial one. It was not easy for Bufong to cook. In his current state, his mental force was almost exhausted. His aura had also become very weak. He panted for a while. Bufong slowly rose to his feet and came to the white tiger heaven stove. The god of cooking's menu floated quietly. Bufong reached out and turned to the last page. The golden characters burst into dazzling light. The look in Bufong's eyes was very complicated. The last dish, Bufong murmured faintly. After walking on the path of the god of cooking for so long, it seemed that it had finally come to an end. Inexplicably, Bufong felt a sense of loss in his heart. It was a very uncomfortable feeling. He exhaled. Bufong took out the ingredients one by one. However, there were not many ingredients. The last dish only had rice and an egg. Egg fried rice. Bufong's eyes became misty. He started with egg fried rice, and now he was going to end with egg fried rice. He shook his head. Bufong slowly raised his eyes and looked at Soul God in the distance. When he did, Bufong froze for a moment. He found that Soul God was no longer as high-spirited and vigorous as he used to be. At this moment, he seemed to have turned into an old man. He leaned weakly against the wall of the wooden hut. The skin on his gray face had turned into ravines, like the folds of a plateau, stacking up one after another. It was a shocking sight. His white hair hung loosely over his shoulders. Soul God looked as if all his life force had been sucked out. The heartless sin of the 7 sects had made him immortal. However, after being deprived of the heartless sin of the 7 sects, Soul God had aged like a mortal. He seemed to be on the verge of death. Bufong had a complicated look in his eyes. He could not believe that this was the end of a great enemy like Soul God. He was deprived of his right to immortality and died of old age. However, this was perhaps the best ending for Soul God. Compared to the sins he had committed, Bufong shook his head and exhaled. He began to cook the last egg fried rice. Crack! The eggs were cracked open. The rice grains were thrown into the pot. A strong aroma surged in an instant. Egg fried rice. It was a dish that Bufong was familiar with, a dish that he could almost cook subconsciously, and it had appeared at such a solemn moment. It made Bufong feel a little strange. The wok was tossed. The fire soared into the sky, illuminating Bufong's face. Bufong's movements seemed to have slowed down. The stir-fry ingredients also slowed down as they flew around. In the distance, Soul God, leaning against the wall, looked at the fire bursting out of the black turtle constellation wok with a wry smile. He seemed to see his old self in the fire. His cloudy eyes were a little dazed. The sound of quiet footsteps rang out. Bufong carried the dish and walked up to Soul God. Bufong also had a complicated look in his eyes. "Come on, have your last meal," Bufong said. He scooped up the egg-fried rice from the blue and white porcelain plate with a porcelain spoon. Faint smoke lingered on the egg-fried rice, making the bowl of egg-fried rice look very exquisite. "It's so beautiful," Soul God murmured weakly as he looked at the rice grains and egg in the spoon. Bufong paused. "What beautiful flowers," Soul God said. The next moment, the wrinkles on Soul God's face twitched involuntarily. He was so old that he burst into wild laughter. He laughed so hard that tears came out his eyes. "Little chef, you'll regret this. Why get rid of my sins? Some things really make me remember." Soul God smiled. There was an inexplicable sympathy in his eyes as he looked at Bufong. "You and I are both in the same pit." The last wisp of the power of the great sins in Soul God's body began to tremble. Bufong frowned. What did Soul God mean? Bufong paused. The spoon of egg-fried rice froze in his hand, and he did not feed it to Soul God. What is ruthlessness? Only when you can kill yourself with your own hands is ruthlessness. Soul God laughed. Suddenly, Bufong felt a great force acting on his hand. The spoonful of egg-fried rice was pushed out by this force and forced into Soul God's mouth. Bufong's pupils constricted. "It's not him. It's not me who fed Soul God just now." Bufong jerked his head to the side. Next to him, the system, which was made of energy lines, appeared quietly beside Bufong, pushed his hand, and fed the egg-fried rice to Soul God. In the distance, the artifact spirits of the god of cooking sets slowly emerged. They turned into human figures and floated quietly in the air. Bufong took a deep breath and looked at Soul God, who had eaten the egg-fried rice. Soul God looked at Bufong with sympathy in his eyes. The next moment, his body began to crack. He opened his mouth. Wisps of black smoke surged out of his 7 orifices, and finally, he completely turned into a black dragon and disappeared. The power of the 7 great sins was completely stripped from Soul God's body. Soul God, on the other hand, was left with a dried-up body. He fell to the ground, old and dying. "Little Shif," the old Soul God looked at Bufong with cloudy eyes and said, enunciating each word. Bufong looked at him. The next moment, his hair stood on end. Buzz, as Soul God's power of the 7th great sins was taken away. A stream of pure energy centered around the wooden hut. It spread in all directions. Rumble. The whole heaven and earth farmland seemed to wake up at this moment. Countless plants grew crazily. On the immortal tree that towered into the clouds, a withered white lotus quietly bloomed. Many experts were attracted by the white, senseless lotus. Tan Tian, Yuan Shi, Tianzuan, Lord Go, and other experts could sense it. The power of the great sins in the wooden hut had disappeared. However, whether it was Lord Go, Hades Era, Tan Tian, or the others, none of them could feel happy. Inexplicably, there seemed to be a more terrible pressure pressing down on them. Ba-thump, ba-thump, ba-thump. The sound of a beating heart rang out. Everyone's pupils constricted as they looked at the wooden hut. The wooden hut began to crumble quietly. Bufong's body slowly emerged. In front of Bufong lay a decaying old body. When the wooden hut scattered like sand, a figure sat quietly not far from Bufong and the old man. He was also an old man. He was no longer breathing, and in his hand, he was holding a heart. Over the heart, the power of the 7 great sins wheeled. Slowly, they fell, wrapped around the heart, and fused with it. Buzz, the system, and the 5 artifact spirits hovered in front of the figure, blocking Bufong's way. The fingers of the elderly man who was sitting cross-legged twitched slightly. Then, he looked up slowly. Looking at Bufong, The corners of the old man's mouth twitched slightly. The next moment, he stuffed the heart that belonged to Soul God into his chest. Congratulations on successfully completing the path to becoming the god of cooking. The old man slowly rose to his feet. As he got up from the ground, his figure began to grow younger, and the wrinkles on his face disappeared. Finally, he turned into an ordinary middle-aged man that Bufong had seen in the Queen of Curse's memory. The latter grinned, revealing a mouthful of white teeth as he looked at Bufong. Unfortunately, the world only needs one god of cooking. Chapter 1849. Unfortunately, the world only needed one god of cooking. His indifferent words resounded through the heavens and earth. It was like the sound of the great Tao, constantly circulating and rumbling. Time seemed to recede on the old man's body like water. The old man's old face suddenly became young. A majestic and powerful heartbeat resounded throughout the world. The artifact spirits of the god of cooking sets floated in front of the old man. As the golden light surged, the god of cooking set turned into a stream of light and rushed toward the god of cooking. The dragon bone kitchen knife, the black turtle constellation wok, the white tiger heaven stove, the Chilean transmigration ladle, the vermilion robe. The vermilion robe on the god of cooking looked different from Bufong's. Bufong's robe was red and white, while the god of cooking's vermilion robe was black and red. With the god of cooking set in hand, the god of cooking slowly closed his eyes. The red and white vermilion robe on Bufong's body didn't disappear, but Bufong could feel that the artifact spirit in the vermilion robe had disappeared. "You are the god of cooking?" However, Bufong was not too shocked. He just looked indifferently at the god of cooking, who was wearing a black and red vermilion robe. Guaranteed to be genuine, the god of cooking chuckled and looked at Bufong with a complicated look in his eyes. After 100 generations of hosts, someone has finally succeeded. Although it was at the last moment before the soul god's birth, no matter what, he succeeded. The god of cooking said, "I should be thanking you. So, I will give you a chance to answer your questions. You must be very confused right now." Bufong retreated and narrowed his eyes. He stared at the god of cooking. At this moment, the atmosphere was not quite right. The god of cooking's resurrection and what Soul God had said before made Bufong a little puzzled. "You are the god of cooking, then who disappeared with the Queen of Curses?" Bufong asked. This was the question that puzzled Bufong the most. "It's me too, but that's the god of cooking." The god of cooking said, his eyes deep. "I once chose the emotional path, but unfortunately, I failed. My physical body decayed. After that time, I understood that only by walking the heartless path can one truly set foot on the supreme realm." The god of cooking narrowed his eyes and took a deep breath, as if he was feeling the beauty of returning to the world. "Wait, I'm a little confused. Help me analyze it." Bufong frowned. He was a little confused by the god of cooking. The surrounding experts all held their breaths. They could sense that the aura of the figure that had reappeared seemed to be somewhat terrifying. Tong Tian, Yuan Shi Tianzuan, and the others all frowned. Lord Go, you, and the others all became nervous. That was because they had also sensed that something was wrong with the situation. Soul God was withered and old on the side. However, the person in front of them, who was filled with boundless vitality and had an incomparably powerful aura, gave them an increasingly cold feeling. The guy in front of him was like a block of ice. He didn't have any emotions, but everything he saw was cold and merciless. To put it simply, the god of cooking of the emotional path and the soul god are both me, but they're separated from me. The god of cooking said with a smile. With his hands clasped behind his back, he walked slowly forward. With every step he took, his aura soared a lot. Bufong stepped back, frowning. "Everything I've set up, including cultivating you, is to break through the shackles and reach the supreme realm. Destroy and rebuild, bury the 7 emotions, purify the evil, and my heart will truly be emotionless. Now, the ruthless path is truly perfected," said the god of cooking. He raised his hand. and his heart beat vigorously, forming a majestic force. Bufong took a deep breath. This was all part of the god of cooking's plan. The so-called ruthless path as the main path, and the emotional path as a supplement were all lies. Soul God was not the god of cooking's sinful thoughts. He was simply another god of cooking. No wonder he was suppressed countless years ago. His body was cut in half, and his heart was taken away. The heart was the real key. At that time, Soul God had the cultivation base of an ancestral god, but he had not perfected the ruthless path. So there was a flaw, and that flaw had caused him to be sealed for countless years. Bufong focused his eyes. Bam! Bufong's feet stomped on the ground, and his figure shot out at high speed. However, the god of cooking just smiled and shook his head. The perfection I'm talking about is flawless. I'm not like the primitive universe's will of the great path, which only has perfected the ruthless path, and I'm not like the former soul god, who only had the cultivation base. I'm truly perfected. The perfection of invincibility. I can even be called above the ancestral god. The god of cooking grinned slowly. He raised his hand. With a flick of his finger, Bufong, who was about to burst out of the wooden hut, suddenly felt a tremendous pressure. It was an irresistible pressure. Rumble, Bufong was forced back and hovered in front of the god of cooking. The god of cooking was getting younger and younger. From a young man, he had become a teenager. His face had become incomparably perfect. As the god of cooking himself said, he was truly perfect now. The god of cooking's hand gently stroked Bufong's face. I really can't bear to do it. You're the most outstanding one I've chosen from the 100 previous hosts. You're my masterpiece. You are my masterpiece, the god of cooking said with a smile. Outside the wooden hut, the experts were in an uproar. Damn it. Tong Tian and the others understood at this moment that all this was a trap set by the guy in front of them. A big plan that involved countless years. This guy was really terrifying. Tong Tian, Yuan Shi Tianzuan, and the other experts felt a chill in their hearts. Unfortunately, you're walking the emotional path, a path that you can't walk to the end of, a path that even I have failed on. The god of cooking said. The god of cooking raised his hand and gently pointed a finger at the void. Immediately, ripples seemed to spread quietly. The god of cooking set cooked automatically. Ingredients flew, knife light flashed, and the sound of cooking rang out. Then, a dish blossoming with countless rays of light emerged. It was a dumpling, an exquisite dumpling. The god of cooking could cook a god of cooking dish with just a thought. Bufong's pupils constricted. He furrowed his brows. The god of cooking chuckled and picked up a dumpling. Slowly, it entered Bufong's mouth. Finally, it was completely stuffed into Bufong's mouth. Is it delicious? The god of cooking asked Bufong. Bufong chewed the dumpling and froze. Because it was really very delicious. Whether it was the heat control, the handling of ingredients, or the adjustment between flavors, they were perfect. The manipulation of taste was beyond Bufong's imagination. It was perfect. This was the god of cooking's dish. This was the realm that Bufong had been looking forward to. Bufong's eyes were slightly dull. For a moment, his heart began to waver. The emotional path, which had always been firm, began to shake at this moment. Boom! All of a sudden, in the distance, Xiao Bai's mechanical eyes flashed with golden light. The soil on the ground exploded. Xiao Bai turned into a beam of golden light and rushed over in a flash. He clenched his fan-like hand, turned it into a huge fist, and went straight for the god of cooking. He had detected that Bufong was in danger and wanted to save Bufong. The moment Xiao Bai made his move, the others also came to their senses. Damn it! Lord Go cursed under his breath, his eyes surging with anger. He threw out his exquisite paw in an instant. The terrifying godly power instantly rippled like a tidal wave. Yu's eyes turned black in an instant. Her black dress fluttered, and she rushed out. She charged toward the god of cooking. Let go of Bufong, Yu said coldly. Boom! The extremely pure curse power surged and turned into a perfectly straight black pillar, which smashed down viciously. Tong Tian, Yuan Tianzuan, and the other experts also made their moves. They activated their divine artifacts, and their magic power surged to the sky. The joint attack of the 5 perfected chaotic saints could be said to be the best in the world. The whole place where the wooden hut was located exploded in an instant. The heaven and earth farmland shook, and a raging blast spread out. Nyohan San and the others rolled on the ground, horrified. F***CK. Hades' Era's face was pale and unsightly. Is he dead? Hades' Era looked up. The blast had messed up his hair, but he had no time to pay attention to it now. He stared at the place where the smoke and dust had exploded in the distance. The next moment, his pupils constricted. The smoke and dust dissipated. The scene inside was revealed. The god of cooking stood where he was with his hands clasped behind his back. He was unscathed. Even Xiao Bai could not get within an inch of the soul god. You don't even have an ancestral god among you? Why do you want to save him? The god of cooking looked at you, Lord Go, and the others in confusion. Then he snapped his fingers. Crack! A crisp sound rang out. An energy blast spread out with the god of cooking as the center. In an instant, it struck everyone's body. Lord Go's body was hit by the ripples. His divine power dissipated in an instant, and he coughed up blood. The same was true for Tong Tian and Yuan Tianzuan. They fell to the ground and flew backward. Yu's body trembled. Her cursed power could not resist, and it shattered in an instant. Her black dress fluttered, and she fell to the ground. With a thud, Xiao Bai fell to his knees. He planted his legs in the ground, trying to stop his body from flying backward. However, he could not do it. The iron skin on his body flew off. The tremendous force caused Xiao Bai to roll backward like an iron ball. You might not understand the meaning of perfection. It means that there are no flaws. You are truly invincible. The god of cooking's striped black and red vermilion robe flapped noisily, supporting his body as he flew into the sky. Bufong sat on the ground, his eyes dull. He seemed to have fallen into infinite self-doubt. Bufong's aura was dispersing as if he was dying. With his hands clasped behind his back, the god of cooking looked at Bufong, shook his head, and clicked his tongue regretfully. He looks very much like me when I failed to walk the emotional path, he said. Soul God's old body fell to one side. His skin was withered and gray, and his eyes were fixed on the god of cooking in the sky. The god of cooking's eyes turned and fell on Soul God, becoming cold and ruthless. It was at this moment that he showed the real, ruthless path. With a flick of his finger, Soul God's eyes were completely fixed. His body turned into sand between his fingers and disappeared. Soul God, the great demon who had made the primitive universe, the chaotic universe, and Void City nervous for countless years, had disappeared without anyone knowing. Everyone's emotions were a little complicated. However, now was not the time to have such complicated emotions. An even more terrible existence was born in heaven and earth. The god of cooking hovered in the sky above the heaven and earth farmland. His gaze slowly swept across the farmland. It was as if he was looking through all the realms. As the god of cooking who had perfected the ruthless path, he could feel the 7 emotions and 6 desires that were constantly surging in all the realms. For him, these were useless and ridiculous emotions. Buzz, the god of cooking, raised his hand. The god of cooking's sets soared into the sky. The artifact spirits emerged. Dragons roared, tigers roared, turtles roared, sparrows cried, and Shilans howled. Each artifact spirit seemed to become ruthless and cold with the return of the god of cooking and the perfection of his ruthless path. Rumble. Each god of cooking's set burst into golden light and rushed into the starry sky. They gathered rapidly in the starry sky. Then they turned into a huge wheel of light. The god of cooking looked at it in fascination. As the ruler of ruthlessness, I naturally want everyone in the world to indulge in ruthlessness. Without the restraint of emotions, the efficiency of everything in the world will be improved. A perfect era led by me will come. Rumble. As the god of cooking's terrible power poured in, The white wheel of light was extremely dazzling, blooming with thousands of rays of light. White specks of light converged. In front of everyone, a plate of steaming delicacies appeared. The dumplings seemed to exude infinite magic. People could not help but reach out and want to eat them. Whether it was a small world, a great world, a small universe, or a great universe, delicacies appeared in front of every living being. These delicacies came in different forms. They could be fried rice or dumplings. They were condensed according to the delicacies that everyone longed for. Everyone could not help but eat the delicacies. They were the most delicious food they had ever eaten. The dishes of the real god of cooking. Their souls were sublimated, and all their emotions collapsed in an instant. Everyone became ruthless. The heaven and earth farmland. A plate of delicacies floated in front of you. Lord Go, Hades Era, and the others. Even they could not restrain their emotions and want to eat the delicacies. Hades Era's eyes widened, and he gritted his teeth. Except for Bu Fong Young Man's spicy strips. I won't eat anything else. Hades Era roared in his heart. In front of him was also a spicy strip. Lord Go's dog paws left explosive marks on the ground. Yu's hair fluttered in the wind. They all had their own persistence to resist the temptation of the god of cooking. However, as countless people in the universe sank into the god of cooking's delicacies, in the end, they would not be able to resist. Bu Fong, Yu, and Lord Go were both looking at Bu Fong, who was sitting on the ground in a daze in the distance. His aura was constantly dissipating as if he would collapse at any moment. It was a kind of collapse after the persistence that he had persisted for a long time collapsed. Mu Hongzi clenched Summer's hand and gave Bu Fong a deep look. He sighed. He and Summer ate the delicacies. They did not resist much, because he knew they could not resist. Sitting on the grass and looking at the senseless lotus blooming on the heaven tree in the heaven and earth farmland, his eyes gradually became misty. Suddenly, at the last moment when Mu Hongzi's 7 emotions and 6 sensory pleasures disappeared, a bright light burst out his eyes. He saw Xiao Bai standing on the heaven tree, his iron-skinned body flapping. Then he plucked the senseless lotus with his leaf-like palm. Boom! With the senseless lotus in his arms, Xiao Bai sped toward Bu Fong like a cannonball. That was what Mu Hongzi told Xiao Bai. Mu Hongzi said the senseless lotus was his last hope, especially the senseless lotus, which had been nurtured for so long. Xiao Bai's golden mechanical eyes flickered. He sped away with the senseless lotus in his arms. Boom! Xiao Bai fell to the ground, ran toward Bu Fong with the senseless lotus in his arms. In the sky, the god of cooking seemed to have noticed it. He raised his eyebrows slightly, stubbornly resisting. He did not think the senseless lotus could help Bu Fong in any way. Could it be that it could also help him forget his emotions? Reach the same level as him? That was impossible. The god of cooking shook his head. However, he did not want any accidents to happen. He raised his hand and pointed a finger into the distance. Xiao Bai's body seemed to be nailed to the ground in an instant. With a bam, he could not move at all. However, at the last moment, Xiao Bai, his mechanical eyes flashed. His fan-like arm exerted force and threw the senseless lotus out. The white, holy, and spotless, senseless lotus drew a beautiful arc in the air. It flew toward you. The god of cooking froze. Lord Go and the others present were also taken aback. Yu's black eyes flickered. Mu Hongzi nodded with a complicated look in his eyes. The next moment, he completely lost his emotions and became cold and ruthless. The whole world became ruthless, and the god of cooking became the supreme being who controlled everything. Yu grabbed the senseless lotus. She seemed to understand what Mu Hongzi meant. Her eyes focused. Then, she slapped the god of cooking's hand away. Her palm was soaked with blood, and in an instant, the white and holy, senseless lotus, it turned crimson, red, and enchanting. The crimson, senseless lotus swayed. Then it shattered into pieces. It turned into a stream of pure essence and poured into Yu's mouth. It tasted a little like the dragon blood rice cooked by Bu Fong. The atmosphere fell silent for a few seconds. Lord Go, Hades Era, Xiaopi, Little Hu, and Johan San, and the others were all staring at you, Rumble. Finally, a terrible aura rose into the sky. It was as if a terrible queen who had slept for billions of years had opened her eyes from the wilderness. Chapter 1850. Wasn't the senseless lotus prepared for Bufong? Lord Go, Hades Era, Johan San, and the others were slightly stunned. They knew about the senseless lotus. It had always been quite mysterious, and they didn't expect that you had eaten it. Of course, Bufong remembered the senseless lotus. Back then, the god of cooking brought him the senseless lotus and asked him to choose between forgetting or having feelings. In the end, Bufong refused the senseless lotus. But now, the senseless lotus had fallen into Yu's mouth in the sky. The god of cooking's eyes narrowed slightly. After you ate the senseless lotus, her aura soared rapidly. For a moment, it was as if a queen who had been sleeping for eternity had awakened. The terrifying curse power turned into a long dragon, rumbling and surging from her body. It suddenly exploded and surged. Now, you had completely turned into the Queen of Curses. The pupils of Lord Go, Hades Era, Johan San, and the others constricted. Xiao Bai's mechanical eyes flashed as he soared into the sky. He landed at Bufong's side. The senseless lotus made people cut off their emotions. In fact, it had the same effect as the god of cooking's food. But it was different. The senseless lotus's emotion was to forget, not to deprive. You had turned into the cold and ruthless queen of curses, her aura fluctuating. In an instant, she broke through the barrier of the perfected chaotic saint realm and stepped into the ancestor god realm. That was the realm of the queen of curses. The queen of curses, the god of cooking, looked at you indifferently, without any emotion in his eyes. Even when you erupted with an aura similar to that of the former queen of curses, the god of cooking's heart didn't fluctuate at all. He, who had mastered the ruthless path, was not affected by these little emotions at all. However, looking at you, who had stepped into the ancestor god realm, the god of cooking narrowed his eyes slightly, because Yu's achievement in the heartless path was somewhat out of his control. You want to say Bufong? The god of cooking narrowed his eyes slightly. Then he raised his hand. A frightening energy suddenly surged out. Landing beside Bufong, Xiao Bai grabbed Bufong's body and suddenly shot out. The place where Bufong and Xiao Bai were standing immediately turned into ruins and chaos. Yu's black dress fluttered as she raised her hand, grabbed a wisp of curse power, and threw it at the god of cooking. Boom! The curse power turned into a terrible vortex and enveloped the god of cooking. Taking advantage of this opportunity, you almost teleported to Xiao Bai's side. Nethery? Lord Go and Hades Era looked at you and asked with concern. You had no emotion on her face. She just nodded and said, "Take Bufong and leave, go to the end of the universe." You said lightly. The curse power surged, trying to bind the god of cooking. However, you didn't really rely on her own comprehension of the heartless path to perfection, so the energy of the senseless lotus would gradually decline. Bam! The god of cooking broke free of the curse power's restraint. His strength was far beyond that of an ordinary ancestor. After all, he had truly comprehended the heartless path to perfection. He was somewhat similar to the Queen of Curses from thousands of years ago, and even a little weaker. She only relied on the senseless lotus to forcibly raise her realm to perfection of the heartless path. However, she should be able to stop the god of cooking for a while. Nethery's eyes had turned pitch black, and they were completely emotionless. Her heart was as still as water. This was the effect of the senseless lotus. When the god of cooking wanted Bufong to eat the senseless lotus, he actually had ill intentions. He wanted Bufong to walk the heartless path so that he could reach the level of soul god faster. Unfortunately, Bufong didn't eat the senseless lotus. Instead, he returned and chose the heartless path. However, everything was going according to the god of cooking's script. Now, the senseless lotus was eaten by you, Apart from Bu Fong and the god of cooking, the only person who knew the effect of the senseless lotus should be Mu Hongzi. So, at the last moment, he asked Xiao Bai to give the senseless lotus to you. He felt that the only person present who had a chance to eat the senseless lotus and break through to the ancestor god realm was the queen of curses air. The god of cooking made heaven and earth ruthless, and he became the only ruler of heaven and earth. All the heartless people became the source of his power. Xiao Bai, Lord Go, Hades Era, and Johan San flew over. They stood in front of Bu Fong. At this moment, Bu Fong's eyes were slightly unfocused, and he seemed to be struggling in his heart. He was hovering between self-doubt and firm belief. The god of cooking's dumplings had shaken Bu Fong's faith. The deliciousness of the dumpling was beyond Bu Fong's reach. Rumble. With curse power swirling around you, she soared into the sky and spread her arms. Then he spread his hands. Countless waves of air rolled out and turned into a huge black curse barrier, enveloping him and the others. Xiao Bai took Bu Fong and flew toward the retreat route left by Tong Tian and the others. The retreat route was the boundless space in the depths of the universe. It was a place that even ancestral gods could not explore. The world was vast, and there were endless unknowns. Even if one reached the ancestral god realm and stood at the top of the universe, there would still be unknown things. If he wanted to escape the god of cooking's pursuit, he could only take Bu Fong into that retreat route. Xiao Bai's mechanical eyes flashed. He knew where the retreat route was. In fact, he really did not want to enter that retreat route unless he had no other choice. Once he entered the unknown region of the universe, he would be in a forbidden state. No matter how mighty his cultivation base was, he could only be immortal in the unknown. Rumble. The god of cooking hovered in the sky. He flicked his fingers gracefully. With a gentle flick of his fingers, a terrible attack fell and slammed hard on the barrier you had created. You ate the senseless lotus. You are heartless. Why do you continue to stop me? The god of cooking said indifferently. Nethery glanced at the god of cooking with her black eyes. There was no fluctuation in them. Two heartless people collided in the void. Although they were heartless, everyone had their own beliefs. The god of cooking's belief was to achieve the highest level, while Yu's belief was very simple, to protect Bu Fong. Therefore, this collision would not end so easily. The god of cooking glanced at Xiao Bai, who was flying away with Bu Fong. Although he knew that the current Bu Fong was no longer a threat to him, he still couldn't help it. But he did not want to leave any variable. Rumble. The god of cooking raised his hand. Slowly, he waved it forward. A supreme will swept across the starry sky of the universe. Yuan Shi, Tianzin, Tongtian, many immortals, and countless experts, they flew up numbly and mercilessly. They raised the weapons in their hands and aimed at the barrier you had transformed. Terrible attacks fell in an instant. The barrier was shattered. Meanwhile, you turned into a stream of light and sped toward the depths of the universe. A large group of immortals and deities chased after her. While Hades Era, Lord Go, and the others were fleeing, they also had to resist the temptation of the god of cooking. For them, this was an extremely uncomfortable experience. You flew beside them, carrying them as they sped toward the vast black hole in the depths of the universe. As time went by, the light in Yu's eyes faded. Ruthlessness had made you lose your liveliness. Xiao Bai's body burst into a dazzling golden light. He had pushed the power of the universe's origin to the extreme. Carrying Bu Fong, he rushed toward the void at top speed. Bu Fong was held in Xiao Bai's arms. His body kept drifting in the strong wind formed by the extreme speed, like seaweed fluttering in the wind. Bu Fong's eyes were unfocused as he looked at the familiar figures behind him. Lord Go was usually very lazy, but at this moment, his eyes were full of anger as he resisted the temptation of the god of cooking's dishes. Hades Era was usually careless and reckless, but at this moment, his eyes were full of determination. The same was true for Little Hu and Xiaopi. They ignored the god of cooking's dishes. However, the god of cooking's dishes tortured their souls. As long as they took a bite of the god of cooking's dishes, they would be completely bound and free from pain. But they did not. It was the same for Johan-san, who was holding 80 in his arms. These are Bufong's old friends who had followed Bufong for a long time. They all had hope in Bufong. They had confidence in Bufong and were firm in their long-lasting friendship. This friendship had started in the Light Wind Empire, and after going through a lot, it had developed into a firm feeling. Bufong's eyes were misty as he looked at his old friends. He had always pursued the emotional path, but until now, he did not even understand what true feelings were. He had returned to the mortal world and walked the earth to understand the feelings of the world. He had gathered thousands of true feelings, but he had neglected the thing that was closest to him. Bufong's gaze fell on you. You was bleeding from the corner of her mouth. Her face had become deathly pale. Her emotionless eyes flashed with pain from time to time, just like the first time he saw you. This exiled, pitiful netherworld woman was suffering pain that others could not bear. Bufong was slightly taken aback. In his memory, although you were cold, you were sometimes playful, a little gluttonous, a little aloof, and would occasionally smile, get angry. However, the current Nethery had reverted back to the netherworld woman who had been banished. Even though she was now standing at the peak of the universe, but in fact for you, she was back to square one. You looked up at Bufong, who was held in Xiaobai's arms. That cold, ruthless, and unfamiliar gaze made Bufong's body tremble. Looking past you, Bufong looked at the tens of thousands of immortal deities who were chasing after them. Those people gave Bufong a strange feeling. Boom! A terrible attack approached. You turned, and the power of the curse soared into the sky. It turned into a terrible energy that swept through heaven and earth. A huge, pitch-black queen who stood across the universe threw out a palm. She used all her strength to pave a way out for Bufong and the others. The god of cooking made a move. Quietly, he threw out a palm in the distant starry sky. The palm shattered Yu's queen shadow. Boom! Terrible blasts blasted out. Lord Go and Hades' era carried Yu's badly wounded body and rushed into the boundless black hole. Xiao Bai's body glowed with golden light, and his iron skin fluttered as he also rushed into the black hole. He was absorbed by the boundless black hole. As soon as he entered, the golden light dimmed. Even Tong Tian and the other experts did not know what was behind the black hole. The god of cooking hovered at the end of the universe, looking indifferently at the spinning black hole with his hands clasped behind his back. The people who had fallen into the black hole, all their divine power had disappeared. They floated in the boundless darkness, not knowing the sun or where they were going. Bufong drifted in the boundless darkness. The struggle in his eyes gradually faded. Between choosing the ruthless path or sticking to the emotional path, he seemed to have made the final decision. The surroundings were deathly quiet. There was no sound. Bufong calmed his mind, thinking and recalling. Many vivid scenes flashed before his eyes. What he had experienced with his old friends also appeared in front of him. Scenes after scenes floated before his eyes. Lord Go was eating sweet and sour ribs. Hades' era was laughing with a spicy strip in his mouth. He was holding dragon blood rice in a cold and aloof manner. Little Who was eating meatballs while spitting out cannonballs. Shrimpy drank fine wine and became a drunk shrimp. There were many other scenes. In the darkness, Bufong let out a long sigh. His chaotic heart, his messy thoughts, all condensed together. The velvet rope tied to his hair broke. The vermilion robe on his body spread out. Bufong looked at the light outside the black hole, at his friends who were drifting with him in the endless darkness. On his face, a gentle smile slowly appeared on his face. Of course, he had chosen the emotional path. Ding! It was like a drop of water falling into a boundless sea. The ripples spread out and swept around the immensity sea, gradually turning into monstrous waves that rolled up to the sky. Bufong's hair was disheveled, and his robe was loose. He steadied himself and slowly walked in the darkness. Even though his body no longer had any Dharma power or divine power, it was still not enough. But At this moment, Bufong seemed to feel that he was beyond heaven and earth, looking at the vast mortal world with a smile. Heaven and earth were ruthless, but wasn't ruthlessness also a kind of love? The god of cooking thought that he had reached the peak of ruthlessness. In fact, it was just the beginning of love. Bufong looked softly at the stiff Lord Go, Yu, and the others. He came to Yu's side and patted Yu's head. He came to Lord Go's side and rubbed Lord Go's head. He came to Hades' Era's side and patted his face. Xiaopi, Little Hu, Xiaobai, they were awakened by him one by one. Everyone looked at him strangely. Bufong looked at them and smiled. Come, let's go back together, Bufong said. The next moment, Lord Go and the others felt their vision blur. Their bodies suddenly appeared outside the black hole that represented the end of the universe. They were too small. In front of the black hole, they were like dust. But even dust was blooming with the brilliance that belonged to them. Outside the black hole, the army of immortals floated in the air. Tan Tian, who was sitting cross-legged in the void, opened his eyes the moment he sensed Bufong. A clanging sound rang out. His sword energy was like a rainbow. The immortal slaughtering sword array and the 10,000 immortals array were activated. Lord Go, Hades' Era, and the others became nervous. However, Bufong just waved his hand. With a thought, he reached out his hand. White specks of light gathered, and the glowing kitchen utensils hovered around Bufong. It felt like a long time had passed, but it was also like an instant. A dish was cooked. A rich aroma spread from the dish in Bufong's hand. It was a plate of dumplings, glistening and translucent. Buzz Tong Tian, whose eyes were full of ruthlessness, paused. The next moment, a dumpling was shoved into his mouth. The god of cooking thinks that he has deprived you of your emotions. But in fact, ruthlessness is also emotion, Bufong chuckled. A dumpling went into his mouth. Tong Tian's sharp eyes gradually softened. He stared blankly at Bufong. His emotions were complicated, and he did not know what to say. Dumplings floated in front of the immortals who had been deprived of their emotions. Just like the god of cooking's dishes, they could not control themselves and ate the dumplings. As soon as a dumpling entered their stomachs, their emotions returned to their bodies. Lord Goat came to Bufong's side, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Bufong boy, give Nethery one of your dumplings too, Lord Goat said. Bufong boy, give Nethery one of your dumplings. There was no reason why Bufong could not restore Yu's emotions when he had restored so many immortals' emotions. You ate the senseless lotus. I will help her slowly find the emotions she has forgotten after dealing with the god of cooking, Bufong said. Bufong said. Lord Go paused. Bufong said nothing more. With many immortals and his friends, he returned to the god of cooking. He crossed the universe. Wherever he passed, the cold and ruthless universe came to life. To Bufong, it was very easy to resolve the god of cooking's ruthlessness. In the soul demon universe, amid the flowers, the god of cooking opened his eyes. Outside the soul demon universe, a faint laugh rang out. Bufong clasped his hands behind his back. His hair was disheveled, and his vermilion robe fluttered, making him look like a carefree immortal. He came walking through the air. Their gazes met across the starry sky. I didn't expect that, after eating my ruthless dishes, you would still have the faith to walk the emotional path, the god of cooking said flatly. Bufong clasped his hands behind his back and smiled. You should know that I walk the emotional path, and my temper is not very good, so I'm back to settle the score with you. Chapter 1851. It was time to settle the score. Bufong said with a faint smile, as if he was chatting with a neighbor, without any hostility. This was the Soul Demon universe, the territory of Soul God. However, Soul God had become a thing of the past. Now, the god of cooking was the only one left in the Soul Demon universe. Flowers were blooming in the starry sky. Everything seemed peaceful, not much different from when Bufong left the Soul Demon universe. The god of cooking did not want to change the Soul Demon universe. His vision now was not limited to the soul demon universe. Heaven and earth had become ruthless because of him, and he was in control of the whole world. The god of cooking opened his eyes and looked at Bufong. He did not seem too shocked by Bufong's appearance. It was as if he had expected it. Of course, it was also possible that at his current level, he would no longer be shocked by anything. He looked indifferently at Bufong. Bufong had a gentle smile on his face. It was hard to imagine that Bufong, who did not smile at all in the past, would smile so frequently now. It was a little hard to get used to. Bufong walked slowly in the void. All the flowers in the soul demon universe seemed to be competing with each other for beauty as he walked. He was the one who planted all the flowers drifting in the starry sky. Every time he planted a dish, a flower would bloom. In his opinion, these dishes had not reached the level of the god of cooking. However, the fact that the god of cooking did not destroy all this surprised Bufong a little. The whole soul demon universe was quiet. With the fall of Soul God, the soul demons who were born because of him turned into black smoke and dissipated into the world. All the soul demons who had been sealed in an entire planet by Bufong had disappeared. The soul demon universe was full of life now. Although it was full of life, the whole world was silent except for Bufong and the god of cooking. Or rather, it was dead silent. It was not bad for the dead world to become the final battlefield of the god of cooking and Bufong. Outside the soul demon universe, the void rumbled as numerous pairs of large eyes emerged, watching the battle in the soul demon universe. Those eyes belonged to the experts who were watching the battle with curiosity, such as sect leader Tong Tian, Yuan Shi Tianduan, and Lord Go. Bufong did not let them in. They needed to solve the grudge between the god of cooking and Bufong themselves. The god of cooking clearly sensed those prying eyes, but there was no expression on his face. He's worthy of being a little fellow who could walk to the end of the god of cooking's path under my guidance. The god of cooking said lightly, if Bufong did not have talent, he would not have been chosen by the god of cooking system. She would not be the most important part of his plan. You were actually able to escape from the black hole at the end of the universe. I thought you would slowly decay inside and become the dust of history. The god of cooking shook his head. He clasped his hands behind his back and slowly walked forward. His aura was so strong that the entire soul demon universe could not contain him. He had mastered the heartless Tao and attained the peak of the universe, enlightened ancestral god realm. The god of cooking was invincible. In an instant, the god of cooking appeared in front of Bufong. For him, a distance of 10 million miles could be covered in an instant. The god of cooking looked indifferently at Bufong. He became very young. Her skin was like white jade, and her eyes were like gems. Although he was emotionless, his body exuded a majestic vitality. The god of cooking and Bufong looked at each other. Their eyes were getting closer and closer, and finally, their faces were almost touching. After a long time, the god of cooking smiled. I didn't expect that you would actually be able to walk your own path on the emotional path. The god of cooking said. Bufong shook his head and looked at the god of cooking. Being emotionless is also having emotions. In fact, I feel that the path of emotion contains the path of emotionlessness. Bufong said seriously. Arrogant, the god of cooking focused his eyes. Boom! The god of cooking was furious. A terrifying roar erupted in an instant. All of a sudden, his body exploded, as if hundreds of stars had exploded at the same time. It was dazzling. Many experts who were watching held their breaths and felt a pang of terror. Compared with the god of cooking when he had just broken through, the current god of cooking was much stronger. The light gradually faded away. Everyone sucked in a cold breath. The entire soul demon universe, at this moment, it had turned into complete ruins. The blooming flowers all withered at this moment, and every single dish that was floating above the stars began to crumble. With just a thought, he had destroyed the entire universe. Fortunately, there were no more living beings in the soul demon universe. The light faded away. Bufong hovered in midair. His hair was disheveled, and his robe fluttered. He was not killed by the god of cooking's aura at all. The god of cooking was slightly taken aback. Not only the god of cooking, but also Lord Go and the other experts who were watching from a distance breathed a sigh of relief. It was good that he was fine. They were really afraid that Bu Fong would be killed by the god of cooking with just one move. Judging by Bu Fong's appearance, perhaps he had taken the last step and stepped into the ancestor god realm. What monster? Lord Go, Hades Era, and the others could not help but sigh. When they recalled Bu Fong's growth, they felt that it was like a dream. Not bad, the god of cooking said, looking at Bu Fong. Bu Fong shook his head. His hair was disheveled, and his vermilion robe fluttered. The god of cooking's vermilion robe was black and red. Bu Fong's vermilion robe was red and white. They looked quite similar. The god of cooking's face turned slightly cold. He flicked his finger. The next moment, the god of cooking sets emerged. The artifact spirits turned into streams of light and rushed toward Bu Fong. The wooden divine dragon, the indifferent vermilion bird, the silent black turtle, the serious white tiger, and the cold Qilin. The 5 Qilins, wrapped in an aura that was almost no weaker than that of an ancestor god, rushed toward Bu Fong. They used to fight side by side with Bu Fong, but now, they were just the god of cooking's merciless weapons. Bu Fong sighed. He looked at his old friends with a complicated look in his eyes. He raised his hand. He gave them a light pat. An invisible ripple spread out. The artifact spirits, who were rushing toward him, froze in midair. You created these weapon spirits, but you stripped them of their emotions. Now let me give them true emotions once again. Bu Fong said. As soon as his voice rang out, his body turned into a beam of golden light, crossing the artifact spirits as if he had teleported. He pointed at the forehead of each artifact spirit. Their eyes, which were cold and merciless, suddenly became lively. There seemed to be a ripple spreading through their bodies. But the artifact spirits disappeared. They turned into beams of light. The dragon bone kitchen knife, the vermilion robe, the Qilin transmigration ladle, the black turtle constellation wok, and the white tiger heaven stove emerged behind Bu Fong. However, Bu Fong did not stop them. Instead, he flicked his fingers, causing the god of cooking sets to shoot out of the soul demon universe and scatter across the universe. The void fell silent once again. Only Bu Fong and the god of cooking were left hovering in midair. After a short standoff, they countered each other. Everything was back to square one. You and I are chefs, so let's solve it the way chefs do. Didn't you say that the world only needs one god of cooking? Bu Fong said. The god of cooking nodded. Bu Fong sat cross-legged in midair. Looking at the god of cooking, he said, So, let's have a chef's challenge. The god of cooking did not refuse. He also slowly sat cross-legged in midair, facing Bu Fong from a distance. Looking at Bu Fong, the god of cooking raised his hand. He waved it rumble. At this moment, heaven and earth became bright. All of heaven and earth, all of the skies of the universe, at this moment, reflected the two figures. How can no one be interested in our chef's challenge? I want the whole universe to witness the god of cooking's grace with their own eyes. The god of cooking said, all the experts in the great worlds, small worlds, great universes, and microcosms raised their heads and looked at the boundless sky. The figures of Bu Fong and the god of cooking were reflected in the sky. When they saw the god of cooking, all of them looked fanatical. They had eaten the god of cooking's dishes and were pursuing the ruthless path. The god of cooking was the object of their fanaticism. The god of cooking was the true god in their hearts. Bu Fong saw through everything at a glance. He turned his head and looked outside the soul demon universe. In the starry sky, there, Lord Go, Hades Era, Xiaopi, Little Huyu, and the others were all hovering in the starry sky, staring at Bu Fong. Their eyes were filled with worry, hope, and the last hope. Now, perhaps only Bu Fong could really face the god of cooking. Feeling the concerned gazes of his little friends, Bu Fong raised his hand, and the corners of his mouth curved upward. Then he snapped his fingers. Light began to surge. The next moment, everything in the soul demon universe changed. Bu Fong's body was in the kitchen of Fong Fong's little restaurant. The god of cooking's eyes were cold as he waved his hand. His body was also in an ordinary kitchen. The final confrontation between the two ended with a chef's challenge. Under everyone's watchful eyes, this world-shaking chef's challenge quietly began. The god of cooking's eyes were ruthless. He had reached the pinnacle of the ruthless path, and he cooked a dish with it. It was the dish he was most proud of in his life. Bu Fong's eyes were gentle. Vivid images flashed before his eyes. Scenes from the Light Wind Empire flashed before his eyes. Then, he slowly picked up an ordinary kitchen knife. The cooking process did not last long. The god of cooking soon finished his dish. He stripped away his emotions and cooked a dish with the most advanced techniques and the best ingredients. Everyone's eyes were attracted by the dish. Bu Fong looked at the god of cooking with a complicated look in his eyes. It was a cooking skill he once pursued. He wanted to use the most advanced techniques and the best ingredients to cook a dish worthy of the god of cooking. Unfortunately, he could not do it, and now the god of cooking had done it. However, Bu Fong did not belittle himself. He could not reach the realm he once pursued. But now, through the emotion realm, he had reached the same realm. However, there were no gorgeous techniques or top-grade ingredients. What he made was just the most ordinary dumplings. Just like when the god of cooking used dumplings to almost crush his faith. Now, Bu Fong also planned to use dumplings to fight back. The dish was done. It floated in midair. The god of cooking's dish shone brilliantly, and its rich aroma wafted through the whole world, causing everyone to sink into it. Bu Fong's dish, on the other hand, looked very ordinary. Under the suppression of the god of cooking's dish, it was inaudible like a speck of dust. Is this the realm that the emotion realm has helped you reach? The god of cooking shook his head, his eyes filled with disappointment. Bu Fong's dish disappointed him. He had experienced ordinary, but ordinary could not help him reach the peak. Today, Bu Fong was in the realm he once was. This was the wrong realm. So, in this chef's challenge, Bu Fong was doomed to fail. Bu Fong smiled faintly. He said nothing. With a flick of his finger, the plate of dumplings flew to the god of cooking. The god of cooking also pushed his dish to Bu Fong. The two of them exchanged the dishes they had cooked. Sitting cross-legged in midair, Bu Fong grabbed a pair of chopsticks and put the god of cooking's dish in his mouth. The food cooked with the best ingredients and the most advanced techniques had reached the pinnacle of deliciousness. The adjustment of the taste and the use of the ingredients made Bu Fong exhale. It was really delicious. Bu Fong sighed with emotion. On the other side, the god of cooking was holding the bowl of dumplings cooked by Bu Fong. He reached out his chopsticks and picked one up. He stuffed it into his mouth. His mouth chewed, and his cheeks trembled slightly. The god of cooking was stunned. The aroma of the dumplings suddenly surged and hit the god of cooking's mouth. The ingredients were very ordinary. The cooking technique was also very ordinary. Everything was very ordinary. But why was it so delicious? The god of cooking was stunned. He reached out his chopsticks again, picked up another dumpling, and stuffed it into his mouth. His movements became faster and faster. The whole plate of dumplings was eaten by him. Why? The god of cooking's mouth bulged. He looked up at Bu Fong. When he asked, he even spat out some of the dumplings in his mouth. There was doubt and disbelief in his voice. It was just like when he gave the dumplings to Bu Fong. He had used his own dishes to almost shatter Bu Fong's faith, making Bu Fong give up halfway on the road of perseverance. And now, Bu Fong had given the god of cooking a taste of his own medicine. He used the same dumplings. The god of cooking was confused. Bu Fong smiled faintly. The cooking path is actually like the heavenly path. Although it seems ruthless, it is actually sentimental. As I said, ruthlessness is actually a kind of emotion. You have used the god of cooking system to teach me the emotional path. In fact, you should know that. If there is anything you don't understand, ask me, and I can teach you. Bu Fong said. The god of cooking paused slightly. He looked at Bu Fong with a complicated look in his eyes. Bu Fong looked at the god of cooking, who suddenly laughed. He did not say anything. Then he snapped his fingers. Between heaven and earth, In front of every person who had eaten the god of cooking's dish, floated their favorite delicacies. After eating them, the emotions that had been taken away from them returned to them. In the dead silence of the soul demon universe, thousands of flowers bloomed on the floating rubble of broken stars. The dead soul demon universe once again surged with vitality. The god of cooking laughed until he burst into tears. There was a complicated look in his eyes. Many emotions welled up in his heart. Many pictures emerged in front of him. There were the little things that Bufong had experienced and the growth of his friends. He fed the Lord Go sweet and sour ribs. Hades Era giggled and begged for spicy strips. You asked for dragon blood rice, and they ate blood lobsters to their heart's content. These scenes were like a series of heavy punches that smashed into his chest. In fact, the god of cooking had experienced all this before. However, on his way to the peak of the cooking path, he had lost too many things. The pictures in front of him finally turned into a familiar figure. It was the picture of him and the Queen of Curses living an ordinary life in the wooden hut. His heart, which had been filled with the ruthless path, suddenly trembled. The god of cooking clutched his chest and laughed. He looked at Bufong with a complicated look in his eyes. He had lost the chef's challenge. Bufong's dishes made him understand. The real god of cooking's dishes might not be exquisite, or they might not use the best ingredients. But what could bring satisfaction and pleasure to people was the best delicacies. There was indeed only one god of cooking in the world. Unfortunately, it was not him. The god of cooking's eyes were deep. The Queen of Curses' voice and smile were getting farther and farther away. The next moment, he came to his senses and found that he, who was young, had once again become an old man. He was neither unwilling nor angry. With a sigh, he gave Bufong a deep look, turned, and left quietly in the starry sky. All that was left was a stooped, staggering figure. Bufong did not chase after him. He did not kill the god of cooking, because there was no bet in this chef's challenge. The world was lonely. Everyone watched the god of cooking's disappearing figure in silence. After a long time, the god of cooking's figure disappeared completely. No one knew where he had gone. There was no grand battle, no earth-shattering killing. The last confrontation between Bufong and the god of cooking came to an end as Bufong staggered. The old god of cooking was gone. There was a new god of cooking in the world, Bufong. The soul demons were completely wiped out. The catastrophe that haunted the hearts of the primitive universe, the chaotic universe, and Void City was completely gone. Everything in the world was back on track. In the primitive universe, Hangu Pass was rebuilt. However, there was no terrifying slaughter at Hangu Pass at the moment. It had just become a place for the primitive universe's new soldiers to train. After the training at Hangu Pass, the new soldiers gathered around the bonfire, tasting the delicacies cooked by the chefs at Hangu Pass, laughing with each other and exchanging their experiences. In the Void universe, the once cursed Nihility universe had now become extremely prosperous. Planets with life filled the starry sky of the universe. Every star had been developed by the people who had originally been exiled and had become full of vitality. Void City had also become the holy land of the Void universe. It was no longer a sinful place to imprison exiles. Instead, it had become a place for new lives to learn and grow. The former District D of Void City had become a food city. All the top chefs of the Void universe were gathered here. The rich aroma of food lingered in the air, enveloping the whole city in a colorful aroma. The only problem was that the Queen of Curses was still nowhere to be seen. The chaotic universe returned to peace. As Heaven God Transmigration, Xiao Yinyu took care of everything in good order. The order of the universe had been restored. More and more experts in the chaotic universe broke through and became heaven gods, making the power of the chaotic universe stronger and stronger. Outside the temple of Heaven God Transmigration, Xiao Yinyu put her hands behind her back and stared at the boundless galaxy. The corners of her mouth lifted slightly. She raised her hand, trying to touch the stars. There was a beautiful meteor shower falling from her slender and fair fingertips. on planet immortality, it was as peaceful and stable as ever. On the boundless continent of the stars, a mountain rose steeply from the ground. At the foot of the mountain was a prosperous town. There were rows upon rows of houses in the small city. The alleys were densely packed, and towering buildings stood on both sides of the wide streets. Restaurants, inns, tea houses, brothels, although the town was small, it had everything. Walking along the main road of the town, past a bustling restaurant, one would come to a deep alley. As one went deeper into the alley, one would find that the scene in front of him had changed. A cozy little restaurant stood quietly in the depths of the alley. A big, fat black dog lay in front of the door, lazily basking in the sun. Beside the dog, Xiaobai sat quietly with his legs spread out, holding a large basin of star cores in his hand and stuffing them into his mouth from time to time. A crunching sound rang out of the machine's mouth. Inside the restaurant, Flowery carried the piping hot dishes and called out to the customers in the restaurant. Nether King Airhot sat in front of a beautiful customer. From time to time, he would say something, causing the beautiful customer to blush. Wu Shuang was leaning against a pillar in the kitchen with a sword in his arms, a blade of grass dangling from his mouth, and a sharp look in his eyes. Little Hu and 80 were playing. Niu Han-san was sitting in a restaurant, drinking with many of his friends at the same table. Ting-a-ling. The curtains of the kitchen were lifted. A slender figure walked out of the kitchen, holding a bowl of steaming sweet and sour ribs in his hand. He walked out of the kitchen, came to the restaurant, and placed the sweet and sour ribs in front of the big black dog. He stroked the dog's head, then turned and went back into the restaurant. The big black dog's lazy look suddenly changed, and he began to gobble up the food. A golden mantis shrimp lay on the young man's shoulder, spitting bubbles from time to time. Quiet footsteps rang out on the upper floor of the restaurant. A graceful figure walked down the stairs. Nethery yawned and rubbed her belly, her face full of resentment. "Bufong, I'm hungry." The young man turned around, looked at you, raised his hand, and rubbed Yu's head. The corners of his mouth curved up slightly on his expressionless face. "Wait for me for a moment." Then he went into the kitchen. Many people in the restaurant greeted you, who came downstairs. The atmosphere was harmonious. In the kitchen, the wok was tossed, and the fire was surging. A rich aroma permeated the kitchen. Bufong looked at the fire, his eyes gradually blurred and satisfied. The dragon blood rice in the wok gave off a rich aroma, and as it boiled, it seemed to emit an enchanting light. Bufong cooked and suddenly smiled. After becoming the god of cooking, he realized his pursuit was very simple. He just wanted to bask in the sun, occasionally cook, and let his old friends enjoy the delicacies. That was all. He was the god of cooking, and his name was Bufong. He did not panic at all. The fire stopped burning. He put down the black wok that was still steaming. Bufong walked out of the kitchen with the steaming dragon blood rice. "You, time to eat." A gentle voice lingered in the restaurant. However, the voice was soon drowned in the noisy laughter. In the kitchen, a kitchen knife was placed quietly on the chopping board. On it, there was a drop of water, stained. It reflected everything in the kitchen, as if it was reflecting the whole world. End of text. That you're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.